Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey through iron gates that once swallowed souls whole. Imagine standing before a massive stone fortress in 1842 London, watching as the heavy doors slam shut behind you. The sound echoes through your bones. You are no longer a person with a name, with a story, with hopes. You're now just a number, a body to be broken, a spirit to be crushed, and the strangest part? For some people living on the streets of Victorian England, this nightmare was actually better than the hell they called home. How did Britain's prisons become places so terrible that they drove people mad, yet so necessary that society built 90 of them in just 35 years? Tonight, we're stepping inside the Victorian prison system, where punishment was an art form, silence was law, and humanity itself seemed to vanish behind those cold, unforgiving walls. So before we walk through those prison gates together, I'd love it if you could take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. But only if this story truly speaks to you. Your support means the world to me and helps me keep bringing these forgotten histories to life. And I'm curious, where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you in bed, maybe with the lights low, sitting by a window watching the rain? Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're joining me from tonight. Now, get comfortable, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan or find some gentle background noise. Let's step back in time together to a place where hope went to die. London, 1838. Picture this. You're standing on a street corner in the East End and you're starving. Not the kind of hungry where you're thinking about your next meal. The kind where your stomach has stopped growling because there's nothing left to digest. Your children haven't eaten in 2 days, the workhouse won't take you because you owe money. And winter is coming, so you do what thousands of others did. You steal. Maybe it's just a loaf of bread, maybe a jacket from a street vendor, maybe some wool from a merchant's cart. Whatever it is, it's enough. Enough to get you caught, enough to get you sentenced, and enough to send you through those iron gates into a world that would change the very fabric of who you are. The Victorian prison system wasn't just about punishment. It was a grand social experiment, a bizarre attempt to solve what the upper classes saw as the great crisis of their time. Crime was rising, cities were growing, and the lower classes were getting harder to control. Between 1800 and 1840, reported crimes in England skyrocketed from about 5,000 per year to over 20,000. The Industrial Revolution had created massive cities, but it had also created massive poverty, and the old methods of dealing with criminals, execution and transportation to Australia were falling out of favour. Hanging someone for stealing a handkerchief seemed excessive even to the Victorians. And Australia, well, by the 1830s, the Australians were getting tired of being Britain's dumping ground for criminals. They were starting to complain, saying, basically, stop sending us your problems. So Britain needed a new solution. The answer? Build more prisons. Lots more prisons. Make them big, make them modern, and make them so absolutely terrible that no one would ever want to commit a crime again. Between 1842 and 1877, Britain embarked on one of the most ambitious building programs in its history. 90 prisons were either built from scratch or massively expanded. This wasn't just construction, this was a statement. These weren't going to be the old ramshackle jails of the past, cramped castle dungeons that leaked and stank and barely held anyone. These were going to be state-of-the-art facilities designed with one purpose: to break you down and rebuild you as a God-fearing, law-abiding citizen, whether you wanted that or not. Now, let me take you to the gates of one of these prisons. Let's say it's Coldbath Fields Prison in London, named after a cold well nearby. Or maybe it's the brand new Pentonville Prison, which opened in 1842 and quickly became the model for all the others. It doesn't really matter which one because the experience was eerily similar across England. You arrive in chains, probably in a cart with other prisoners. The building looms before you, all dark stone and tiny windows. It looks less like a building and more like something that wants to swallow you. And in a way it does. The first thing that happens is the stripping away. Literally. Your clothes, whatever rags you manage to keep, are taken from you. Every piece of your old life is removed. You're given a cold bath, freezing utsta that makes you gasp and shiver. Your head is shaved if you're a man. If you're a woman, your hair might be cut short. This isn't about hygiene, though that's what they tell you. This is about identity, about making sure you understand that you are no longer the person who walked through those gates. Then comes the uniform. Usually it's rough fabric that scratches your skin, often marked with arrows or broad stripes so that if you somehow escape, everyone will know what you are. A criminal, an outcast. The uniform was deliberately uncomfortable. It wasn't supposed to fit well. It was supposed to remind you every single moment that you didn't belong to yourself anymore. You belonged to the system. But here's where it gets interesting, in that dark, twisted way that Victorian society specialised in. Not all prisoners had the same experience entering prison. If you had money, if you came from a family that could pay, you could buy privileges, better food, a private room instead of a shared cell, the ability to receive visitors, books to read, letters from home, even the right to keep a pet. Yes, you heard that correctly. Wealthier prisoners sometimes kept cats or birds in their cells. One historical account from the early Victorian era describes a debtor's prison, where middle-class inmates essentially ran their own little society. They had musical evenings, they organised concerts in the courtyard. Meanwhile, in the same prison, in different wings, poor prisoners were starving, sleeping on stone floors and dying of diseases that swept through the overcrowded cells like wildfire. This wasn't unusual. Each prison was essentially run by its governor or jailer as his own personal kingdom. He made the rules. He decided who got what. And if you wanted anything beyond the bare minimum, which was often barely enough to survive, you paid for it. You even had to pay the jailer to be let out when your sentence was finished. Imagine that. You've served your time, you've suffered through months or years of imprisonment, and at the end, they won't even open the door unless you can pay an exit fee. If you couldn't pay, you just stayed there. A prisoner of poverty even more than of justice. Let me tell you about Mary Ann Cotton. Not the famous serial killer of the same name, but a different Mary, one of thousands of poor women who cycled through the Victorian prison system. Historical records show she was arrested in 1839 for stealing items from the household where she worked as a maid. 2 silver spoons, a linen tablecloth, and a small brass candlestick. She pawned them for a few shillings to feed her children after her husband had been killed in a factory accident. When Mary entered Newgate Prison, the infamous fortress in London, she was 26 years old. She had 3 children who were immediately taken from her and sent to the workhouse. She would never see them again. In prison, Mary was assigned to oakum picking. We'll talk more about that brutal task later, and given the same meal every day. Bread, watery gruel, and occasionally some cheese so hard it could break your teeth. But here's the thing that haunts me about Mary's story, and stories like hers. For the first time in months, she knew where her next meal was coming from. It wasn't good food, it was barely food at all, but it was regular. She had a roof over her head, even if that roof was the ceiling of a tiny, damp cell. She wasn't going to freeze to death on the street. This was the horrifying reality of Victorian England. For many of the poor, prison was actually an improvement. That tells you something terrible about life outside those walls, doesn't it? When losing your freedom, losing your children, losing your identity. When all of that is better than your daily life, something has gone catastrophically wrong with society. The Victorian middle and upper classes didn't see it that way, of course. They saw prisons as necessary, as righteous even. They believed in what they called moral reform. The idea was that criminals weren't just lawbreakers. They were morally corrupted individuals who needed to be isolated from society and from each other so they could reflect on their sins, repent, and emerge as better people. This belief system, this almost religious fervour about punishment and redemption, would shape everything about the Victorian prison experience. It would lead to some of the most psychologically damaging practices ever implemented in the name of justice. And it would create a prison system so brutal, so dehumanizing that its effects are still being felt today. Because here's something that will surprise you. 32 of those Victorian-era prisons are still in operation right now. In 2025, they still hold prisoners. 22,000 people, about 1/4 of England's current prison population, are locked up in buildings that were designed in the 1800s. Buildings that were considered outdated and problematic by the early 1900s. That's how long shadows can last. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now we're still standing in that entrance area, watching as Mary and hundreds like her are processed, catalogued and prepared for what comes next. The real horror hasn't even started yet. The entrance was just the beginning. The opening of a door that would close behind these prisoners with a finality that many of them, even the ones who survived, would never fully escape. There's something almost theatrical about the Victorian approach to imprisonment. Every detail was considered, every aspect designed to send a message. The massive doors weren't just functional, they were psychological weapons. When they slammed shut, everyone heard it. The prisoners, the guards, the people outside, that sound said, "This person is no longer part of society. They have been removed. They have been erased." And once you were inside, the transformation was immediate and total. You were no longer addressed by your name. You were a number now. Prisoner 412, Convict 700. The records didn't care about your story, your reasons, your humanity. They cared about one thing, your crime and your soul's substance. That's what defined you now. That's all you were. The architecture itself was a form of punishment. These buildings were designed to intimidate, to overwhelm, to make you feel small and powerless. Thick stone walls that blocked out the sounds of the outside world. Tiny windows that let in just enough light to see, but not enough to feel any warmth. Narrow corridors that echoed with footsteps and the rattle of chains. Everything was calculated to reinforce one message. You are nothing. You have no power. You will obey, and obey you did, because the alternative was always worse. The Victorian prison system had a hierarchy of punishments for disobedience. Breaking the rules could mean reduced food rations. You'd go from barely enough to eat to genuine starvation. It could mean solitary confinement in a pitch-black cell, sometimes for weeks. It could mean flogging, being whipped with a leather strap or a cane until your back was raw and bleeding. It could mean the treadwheel, but we'll get to that particular torture device soon enough. The point is, from the moment you entered a Victorian prison, you understood that resistance was futile. You could comply or you could suffer. Those were your options. And suffering in a Victorian prison, well, that could be a lot worse than you might imagine. As we close this first part of our journey, I want you to think about something. Think about what it means to have your identity stripped away, to be reduced to a number, to be told that everything you were before doesn't matter anymore. The Victorians believed this was necessary. They believed it was moral. They believed that by breaking people down completely, they could build them back up as better citizens. But what they actually created was something far more complex and far more troubling. They created a system that would lead to mental breakdowns, to suicides, to a form of suffering so profound that it would eventually force them to change course. Not quickly, mind you. The Victorians were nothing if not stubborn. But eventually the cracks in their grand experiment would become too obvious to ignore. Next, we're going to step deeper into these prisons and explore the architecture itself. Because these weren't just buildings, they were machines, designed with cold precision to control every aspect of a prisoner's life. We're going to walk through those radiating wings, peer into those tiny cells, and understand how the very structure of these places was meant to break the human spirit. And we'll discover why, despite being over 150 years old, these designs still shape how we think about imprisonment today. The story is just beginning. The gates have closed behind us, and now we're truly inside. Picture yourself standing in the center of a massive wheel, with corridors stretching out from you like spokes on a bicycle. Above you, iron railings climb 3, sometimes 4 stories high. Below you, stone floors worn smooth by decades of shuffling feet. Everywhere you look, cell doors, hundreds of them, identical, endless, and from your position at the hub you can see down every single corridor at once. Nothing is hidden. No prisoner can move without being watched. This is the architecture of control. This is what the Victorians called progress. Welcome to the design that would define imprisonment for over a century, the radial or hub-and-spoke prison layout. And it all started with one building that would change everything, Pentonville Prison, which opened its doors in 1842 in North London, though I suppose opened its doors is the wrong phrase. It's more accurate to say it closed its doors on 520 souls, each locked in their own private hell, each convinced they were utterly alone. Captain Joshua Jebb was the man behind Pentonville's design, a royal engineer with a vision. And when I say vision, I mean it in both the architectural and the almost religious sense, because Jebb didn't just want to build a prison, he wanted to build a machine for transforming human souls. The cost? £84,186, 12 shillings and 2 pence, an astronomical sum in 1840. For context, a working-class family might live on £30 a year. This was a statement of national commitment. Britain was serious about punishment. But let's walk through this building together, because the details matter. Every single architectural choice was deliberate, calculated to achieve a specific psychological effect. Imagine you're a prisoner arriving at Pentonville for the first time. You've already been stripped, bathed, numbered. Now you're being led to your cell. But here's the thing, they put a hood over your head first. A thick canvas bag that covers your entire face with just small holes to breathe through. Why? Because you're not allowed to see other prisoners. You're not allowed to make eye contact. You're not allowed to recognize anyone or be recognized. From this moment forward, you're isolated, completely, utterly, absolutely alone. The guard leads you by the arm down one of those radiating corridors. You can hear your footsteps echoing off stone walls, but you can't see where you're going. Eventually you stop. A door creaks open. The hood is removed. And you see your new home, 13 feet long, 7 feet wide, 9 feet high. These were the exact dimensions of a Pentonville cell, and they became the standard that other prisons copied. Think about that for a moment. 13 by 7. That's about the size of a modern parking space. Now imagine living in a parking space for months, for years, with walls so thick that no sound could pass through them. The Victorians were obsessed with this idea of cellular isolation. The word cell itself comes from the Latin word for a monk's room, a small chamber for solitary prayer and contemplation. That was exactly what they thought they were creating. Little rooms where criminals would contemplate their sins, pray for forgiveness, and emerge as reformed individuals. What they actually created was something more like sensory deprivation chambers. But we'll get to the effects soon enough. Each cell had a narrow bed, more of a wooden shelf really, with a thin mattress filled with straw or coconut fibre, a small table bolted to the wall, a chair, A Bible, always a Bible, placed prominently where you couldn't ignore it. A small alcove carved into the wall specifically designed to hold a candle so you could read the Bible at night. Even the lighting was theological. They wanted you reading scripture, not anything else. The door was low and narrow, deliberately sized for the average Victorian body, which was smaller than people today. You had to bend down to enter or exit. Some historians think this was another psychological trick, forcing prisoners to literally bow as they entered their cell, a physical reminder of submission. The window was high up and small, maybe 12 inches by 8 inches, just large enough to let in a sliver of natural light, but not enough to see anything outside. Certainly not enough to escape through. But the most chilling detail, the thickness of the walls between cells. At Pentonville, the walls were several feet thick, specifically designed to prevent sound from travelling. The Victorians wanted absolute silence. They believed that if prisoners could communicate even through walls by tapping or shouting, they would corrupt each other. The experienced criminals would teach the first-time offenders how to be better criminals, so they built walls that could swallow sound. Can you imagine that? Being locked in a space so isolated that even if you screamed, nobody would hear you? Now here's where the design gets really interesting. From the central hub where the guards stood, they could see down every corridor. They could watch the cell doors. But, and this is important, they could not see inside the cells. This wasn't a panopticon, despite what many people think. A true panopticon, designed by philosopher Jeremy Bentham, would have allowed guards to see into every cell at once. Pentonville was different. The guards could see where prisoners were, but not what they were doing. This meant constant inspections, constant door openings, constant invasions of what little privacy a prisoner might have. Think about living like that, never knowing when your door might swing open, never knowing if someone is watching you through the small observation slot. Always aware that at any moment your tiny bubble of solitude could be pierced by a guard demanding to see what you're doing, checking that you're working, verifying that you're still alive. Because yes, prisoners did die in their cells, and sometimes no one noticed for hours. Between 1842 and 1848, 54 prisons in England were built or remodelled using the Pentonville design. 54. That's nearly one new prison every 6 weeks for 6 years straight. This wasn't just construction. This was a national transformation of how Britain handled crime. Every one of these prisons had that same hub-and-spoke layout, that same commitment to isolation, that same belief that breaking a person down was the first step to building them back up. But did it work? Well, that depends on what you mean by work. If the goal was to punish, then yes, absolutely. The architecture succeeded brilliantly at making prisoners suffer. If the goal was to reform criminals into better people, then, well, we need to talk about what actually happened inside these cells. Spoiler alert, it wasn't pretty. Let me tell you about something that might surprise you. Some cells at certain prisons had larger windows than others, not because the architects were feeling generous. No, those cells were specifically designated for prisoners with tuberculosis. The Victorians knew that fresh air and sunlight could help with the disease, so they made small accommodations. In the middle of a system designed to crush humanity, there were these tiny pockets of something almost like compassion. Almost. Because even prisoners dying of tuberculosis were still kept in isolation, still forbidden from speaking, still required to work until they literally could not hold the tools anymore. The attention to architectural detail extended to every corner of these prisons. The candle alcoves I mentioned earlier weren't just practical. They were positioned at a specific height and angle so that the light would fall directly on a Bible if one was placed on the small table. The prison chaplains insisted on this design feature. They wanted God's word literally illuminated for the prisoners. Everything, and I mean everything, was thought through with this bizarre mixture of practical panology and religious fervour. Walking through the corridors of a Victorian prison must have been a strange experience even for the guards. The silence would have been oppressive. In older prisons from the Georgian era, you'd hear shouting, laughing, fighting, all the chaos of human beings crammed together. But in these new Victorian prisons, especially Pentonville, the silence was so profound it was almost like a physical presence. Guards reported that it felt unnatural, disturbing, like walking through a tomb where the dead were still breathing. Have you ever been somewhere so quiet that you can hear your own heartbeat? That's what these prisons were like. The thick walls, the separated cells, the rules against talking, they all combined to create an acoustic deadness that felt wrong on some deep instinctive level. Humans are social creatures. We're wired for sound, for communication, for the ambient noise of other people existing nearby. Take that away completely, and something breaks. We'll see just how badly it breaks when we get to the mental health crisis that these prisons created. But for now, just understand that the architecture itself was a form of torture. From the hub, a guard could blow a whistle, and the sound would carry down all the corridors simultaneously. This was how orders were given. One whistle pattern meant wake up, another meant time for chapel, another meant begin work. The prisoners learned to recognize these sounds like animals learning their keeper's calls. Your whole life reduced to responding to whistles and bells, moving when told to move, stopping when told to stop, existing only as directed by unseen authorities at the center of the wheel. The Victorians were so proud of this design that they built even larger versions. Some prisons had 6 wings instead of 4. Some had 5 tiers of cells instead of 3. They kept expanding the concept, making the prisons bigger and bigger, housing more and more prisoners in identical cells in identical wings. It was industrialization applied to punishment. The same principles that were revolutionizing factories, efficiency, standardization, mass production, were now being applied to human suffering. And the most haunting part? Many of these buildings are still standing, still functioning, still holding human beings in cell halls designed over 150 years ago for bodies and minds that were supposed to break under isolation. When you visit England today and pass by these massive Victorian prisons, they look like fortresses, castles of stone with tiny windows. And in a way, that's exactly what they are. Fortresses designed not to keep enemies out, but to keep souls in. The architecture of Pentonville and its descendants represents something deeper than just prison design. It represents a philosophy. The idea that isolation plus reflection equals redemption. That if you separate a person from all human contact and force them to face themselves in a small stone box with nothing but a Bible and their own thoughts, they will emerge better, transformed, ready to rejoin society as productive citizens. It's almost funny in a dark way how wrong they were. But they didn't know that yet. In 1842, when Pentonville opened, the reformers truly believed they had cracked the code. They had created the perfect prison. A place that was humane, they actually used that word, because it didn't rely on physical brutality. No torture, no beatings, just architecture and silence and time. What could be more civilized than that? Of course, they would soon discover that there are many ways to torture a person, many ways to break a mind, and that sometimes the cruelest prisons are the ones that don't leave visible scars. As we prepare to step even deeper into this world, I want you to hold on to one image, that central hub, that point from which everything radiates. The guard standing there could see every corridor, every landing, every door, but he couldn't see the prisoners, couldn't see what was happening inside those cells, couldn't see the slow unraveling of minds that the architecture itself was causing. He could see the machine working. He just couldn't see what the machine was producing, and what it was producing, as we're about to discover, was madness, a particular kind of Victorian madness born from doubt, isolation, and the crushing weight of being utterly, completely alone. The architects had built a machine for creating better people. But machines don't always work the way their inventors intended. Sometimes they break down, and sometimes they break the very things they were meant to fix. So let's walk down one of those radiating corridors. Let's open one of those heavy cell doors. Let's step inside and see what the Victorian system of separate confinement really meant for the human beings trapped within it. Because the architecture was just the beginning. The real horror was what they did with it. Silence. Not the peaceful kind you might enjoy on a quiet evening. Not the comfortable silence between friends who don't need to fill every moment with words. No, this was a different kind of silence. The kind that presses against your eardrums. The kind that makes you question whether you've gone deaf. The kind that after days and weeks and months starts to feel like it's crushing your skull from the inside. This was the separate system, and it was, without exaggeration, one of the most psychologically devastating experiments ever conducted on human beings in the name of justice and reform. The concept came from America, specifically from the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Quaker reformers there had developed what they believed was a humane alternative to the brutal physical punishments of earlier eras. Instead of whipping prisoners, instead of putting them in stocks or pillories, instead of branding them or maiming them, why not simply separate them? Give each prisoner their own cell. Keep them away from the corrupting influence of other criminals. Let them reflect on their sins in solitude. Through silent contemplation and religious instruction, they would see the error of their ways and choose to change. It sounds almost reasonable when you put it that way, doesn't it? But the reality was something else entirely. Two men fell in love with this system and brought it to England. William Crawford and Reverend Whitworth Russell. These weren't cruel men by the standards of their time. They genuinely believed they were doing good. They had visited Philadelphia in the 1830s and come back convinced that they had seen the future of criminal justice. They became the loudest voices advocating for what they called separate confinement to be implemented across Britain. And in 1842, when Pentonville Prison opened, they got their wish. Here's how it worked in practice. From the moment you entered Pentonville, you were forbidden from communicating with any other prisoner. Not a word, not a gesture, not even eye contact. When you were moved from your cell, whether to the exercise yard or the chapel or anywhere else, you wore that hood I mentioned earlier. A thick canvas mask that covered your entire face. You could breathe through small holes. You could see the ground directly in front of your feet through a slit. But you couldn't see other people, and they couldn't see you. In the chapel, which prisoners were required to attend daily, each person sat in an individual wooden stall. Imagine a series of tall boxes, like old telephone booths arranged in rows. You sat in your box facing the chaplain. You could hear his sermon. You could hear the hymns, but you couldn't see the person in the box next to you. You couldn't turn your head. You were alone with God and your sins, exactly as the system intended. Exercise time was equally isolated. The prison had small exercise yards, and at Pentonville these yards were divided into separate wedges, like slices of a pie. Each prisoner got their own slice. You could walk in a circle in your wedge for 1 hour per day. You could see the sky if the weather was clear, but you couldn't see other prisoners. Walls separated each wedge. You were outside breathing fresh air, and yet you were just as alone as you had been in your cell. 23 hours a day in your cell, 1 hour in an isolated exercise yard every day, for months, for some prisoners for years. The original plan at Pentonville was to keep prisoners in this system for 18 months before transporting them to Australia. 18 months of almost total isolation. Can you imagine that? 18 months without a real conversation, without seeing another person's face. without human touch except when a guard grabbed your arm to lead you somewhere. The work you did was also solitary. In your cell you might be given oakum to pick, old rope to unravel, or weaving to do, but you did it alone. You ate alone. You slept alone. You woke to silence, worked in seats, and went to sleep in silence. The only voices you heard regularly were the chaplain during services and occasionally a guard giving you orders. That was your entire world. Now, Crawford and Russell insisted this was different from what had happened in Philadelphia. They had heard about the high rates of mental illness at Eastern State Penitentiary. They had even heard Charles Dickens condemn the system after his visit there in 1842. Dickens wrote that the prisoners looked dejected and broken-hearted, and he called the system a form of torture that left no physical marks but destroyed minds. Crawford and Russell dismissed these concerns. They argued that their system would be better. They would have more chaplain visits, better ventilation in the cells. They used words like cheerfulness to describe how the prisoners would feel. They were catastrophically wrong. Within months of Pentonville opening, the prison's medical officer was documenting case after case of what he carefully called mental symptoms. Let me read you some actual excerpts from the prison journals from 1846, just 4 years after opening. These are real records preserved in the archives. Prisoner number 700 shows symptoms of hallucination, stating the warders poison his food and believes the medical men know it, but wish to kill him to examine his body. Convict Thomas Sharp, number 700, is worse and looks ill, refuses to take his medicines, recommended that said prisoner should be walked about the grounds with an attendant. Convict John Vincent is showing signs of insanity. He believes he will not be transported and makes reference to this hallucination frequently. Convict William Hancock's reason was totally upset for 12 months. These weren't isolated incidents, these were entries from just 1 month. Every month the journals recorded similar cases. Prisoners who believed snakes were coiled around their cell bars. Prisoners who heard voices coming from the ventilation system. Prisoners who were convinced the food was poisoned. Prisoners who stopped speaking entirely, even when directly questioned. Prisoners who wept constantly. Prisoners who had to be restrained in straitjackets because they were trying to harm themselves or destroy their cells in fits of panic. The chaplains and prison administrators had a ready explanation for all this. The prisoners were faking it. They called it shamming. The prisoners were just pretending to be insane to avoid work or to get special treatment or to avoid being transported to Australia. Never mind that the alternative, admitting that the system itself was causing these breakdowns, would mean acknowledging that their grand experiment was a failure. Some prisoners probably were pretending. Human beings in desperate situations will try anything to escape their suffering. But the sheer volume of cases, the consistency of symptoms, and the fact that these mental breakdowns happened to prisoners who had no prior history of mental illness, all of this suggested something more sinister was happening. In 1851, a prominent psychiatrist named Dr. Forbes Winslow published findings in The Lancet, Britain's leading medical journal. He stated that approximately 1.4% of Pentonville's prisoners were suffering from mental disorders. That might not sound like much until you compare it to the rate of mental illness in the general population at the time, which was about 0.25%. In other words, prisoners at Pentonville were more than 5 times more likely to go insane than people outside, and Winslow himself admitted that this was probably a huge underestimate because prison officials were reluctant to officially diagnose insanity. The real rate was likely much higher. Peter Lorre, who was the president of Bethlehem Royal Hospital, London's famous asylum for the mentally ill, publicly called Pentonville a disgrace. He told the Times newspaper that by 1847, just 5 years after opening, Bethlehem had received 40 prisoners transferred from Pentonville, all of them driven mad by the separate system. 40 people in 5 years from just one prison. He called it the direct result of the separate system. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from the ships that transported prisoners from Pentonville to Australia. The ship's surgeons, who were responsible for the prisoners' health during the voyage, kept detailed records, and they noted something strange. Prisoners who came from Pentonville suffered from what they called hysteric fits, far more than prisoners from other prisons. These fits would come on suddenly, often as soon as the prisoners were brought on board the ship. The surgeons had never seen anything like it with prisoners from other institutions. It was as if the extreme isolation at Pentonville had wound these men so tight that any change in environment caused them to snap. Think about what this means. These men had survived 18 months of near total isolation, 18 months of silence and solitude. And the moment they were finally around other people again, even in the terrible conditions of a convict ship, their minds couldn't handle it. The isolation had fundamentally changed something in their psychology. The architects of the system refused to admit defeat. Crawford and Russell continued to defend separate confinement publicly right up until their deaths in 1847. It's almost poetic in a tragic way that they both died suddenly in the same year, just as the evidence against their beloved system was becoming impossible to ignore. They died believing they had created something good, something moral, something that would transform criminals into better people through the power of isolation and reflection. After their deaths, the system began to change, but slowly, so slowly. In 1848, Pentonville reduced the period of separation from 18 months to 12 months. In 1853, they reduced it further to 9 months. But even 9 months of near total isolation is an eternity when you're living it. And many other prisons continued to practice full separation for much longer. Some prisons in Ireland implemented the separate system in the 1850s and continued it well into the 1860s. Why did it take so long to change? Partly because of pride. The British government had invested enormous amounts of money and prestige in this system. Admitting it didn't work meant admitting a massive failure. Partly because of religion. The chaplains, who had more power in these prisons than the doctors, truly believed that solitary contemplation was the path to redemption. To them, the mental breakdowns were either the prisoners faking or evidence of the devil fighting against the prisoners' attempts to reform. Either way, the solution was more prayer, not less isolation. And partly, I think, because the people making these decisions never experienced what the prisoners experienced. The governors, the chaplains, the prison commissioners, they visited these silent cells, but they didn't live in them. They could leave at the end of the day. They could go home to their families, to conversation, to normal human interaction. They couldn't truly understand what it felt like to be entombed in silence day after day, with only your own thoughts for company, thoughts that, after enough time, start to turn against you. There's a particular kind of torture in forced isolation. Your mind needs stimulation, needs interaction, needs the back and forth of human connection. Without it, your thoughts start to loop. You have the same memories, the same regrets, the same fears cycling through your head endlessly, because there's nothing new to replace them with. And eventually those loops become worn paths in your mind, grooves that get deeper and deeper until you can't think about anything else. That's when the hallucinations start. That's when the walls start to seem like they're moving. That's when you start hearing voices, or seeing things that aren't there. Your brain, desperate for stimulation, begins to create its own. The Victorians called it prisoner's madness. We might call it something closer to sensory deprivation psychosis. Whatever you call it, it was real, it was widespread, and it was a direct result of the separate system. And yet, even as the evidence mounted, Even as more and more prisoners were transferred to asylums or released on mental grounds, the system persisted. Because it was easier to blame the prisoners than to blame the system, easier to say they were weak or predisposed to madness than to admit that isolation itself is a form of violence. As we move forward, we need to remember what we've learned here. The separate system wasn't created by monsters. It was created by people who thought they were doing good, who believed that isolation would lead to reflection, reflection would lead to repentance, and repentance would lead to reform. They built an entire prison system on this belief, and it broke people's minds by the hundreds, maybe the thousands. Good intentions, as they say, are not enough. Sometimes they're just the beginning of a different kind of horror. But the psychological torture of isolation was only part of what made Victorian prison so devastating. There was also the physical work, the pointless soul-crushing labour that prisoners were forced to perform for hours every day, work that served no purpose except to break your body and your spirit. And that's where we're headed now, to the treadwheels and the cranks, to the oakum sheds and the stone-breaking yards. To the Victorian belief that the best way to reform a criminal was to work them until they couldn't stand, to give them tasks so monotonous and meaningless that their minds would simply give up resistance. The silence was bad. But the labour, well, that was a whole different kind of nightmare. There's a sound I want you to imagine. A rhythmic clacking, like a giant wooden clock that never stops ticking. Footsteps climbing stairs that go nowhere. The creak and groan of a massive wheel turning, powered by human legs that never rest. Behind it all, heavy breathing. Sometimes a gasp, sometimes a cry of pain quickly stifled, because showing weakness could mean punishment. This was the soundtrack of Victorian prison labour, and at its centre was a machine so cruel, so brilliantly designed to crush the human spirit, that even other forms of punishment looked merciful in comparison. They called it the treadwheel, but prisoners had other names for it. The everlasting staircase, the shin scraper, the grinding machine. And if you were unlucky enough to be sentenced to hard labour in a Victorian prison, you were going to become intimately familiar with this device, whether you wanted to or not. Hard labour, hard fare, and hard board. These were the three promises that Sir Edmund Duquesne, the Assistant Director of Prisons, made to the British public in the 1860s. It was a slogan, a guarantee that criminals would suffer appropriately for their crimes. Hard labour meant back-breaking work. Hard fare meant barely enough food to survive. Hard board meant sleeping on wooden planks with minimal bedding. Together they formed the trinity of Victorian prison punishment. And of these three, the labour was perhaps the most ingenious in its cruelty because it didn't just hurt your body. It attacked your sense of purpose, your dignity, your very understanding of what it means to be human. Let me take you to the treadwheel first, because understanding this machine is key to understanding the Victorian mindset about punishment. Picture a large cylinder, maybe 20 feet in diameter, with wooden steps attached all around its circumference. Kind of like a water wheel at a mill, but instead of water, it's powered by prisoners. The wheel is divided into separate compartments by wooden partitions, so each prisoner has their own section. You can't see the person next to you, but you can hear them. You can hear everyone. You step up onto the wheel, there's a handrail in front of you, hold on to. The wheel begins to turn and you start walking. Your job is to keep stepping, keep climbing these stairs that appear beneath your feet and disappear behind you. Step, 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 step. Over and over. The wheel turns because you and 19 other prisoners are all stepping at the same rate. If you slow down, you'll fall. The wheel doesn't care, it keeps turning, so you keep climbing. 10 minutes on, 5 minutes off. That was the typical rotation. You'd climb for 10 minutes, then step off and rest for 5, then back on for another 10. This went on for 8 hours a day, sometimes more. Do you want to know how many steps the average prisoner took in a day on the treadwheel? 57,000 steps. Let me say that again. 57,000 steps. That's the equivalent of climbing over 8,000 feet in altitude. Higher than most mountains. Except you're not actually going anywhere. You're just stepping and stepping and stepping in the same spot, hour after hour, day after day. And here's the truly cruel part. In some prisons, the treadwheel was connected to machinery. Maybe it ground corn into flour. Maybe it pumped water. So you could tell yourself that your suffering had a purpose. You were creating something, contributing something, even if you were a prisoner. But in many prisons, especially as time went on, the treadwheel wasn't connected to anything. It just turned. Your labour produced nothing. It was suffering for the sake of suffering. Punishment for the sake of punishment. The Victorians called this penal labour. Work designed not to be productive, but to be punishing. The physical toll was immense. Your legs would burn, your lungs would scream for air. Your hands gripping the rail for dear life would cramp and blister. Prisoners regularly fell off the treadwheel from exhaustion. When you fell, the wheel didn't stop. It would bash you against the platform until the guards noticed and pulled you off. Some prisoners lost fingers or toes to the mechanism. Some broke bones. The medical records from Victorian prisons are full of treadwheel injuries. But you know what's almost worse than the physical pain? The absolute pointlessness of it. Human beings need purpose. We need to feel like our effort means something. Even in terrible conditions, people can endure if they believe their work matters. But take that away, make the work meaningless, and it breaks something deep inside. That's what the treadwheel did. It took your strength, your time, your pain, and transformed it into nothing. Just the endless turning of a wheel. Now, the treadwheel wasn't the only form of hard labour. Oh no, the Victorians were creative in their cruelty. Let me introduce you to the crank. The crank was a mechanical device installed in many cells. Imagine a handle like the crank on an old-fashioned car engine, mounted on the wall or on a box. Your job was to turn this handle, around and around and around. How many times? Well, that depended on the prison and the prisoner's sentence, but typically you had to complete between 10,000 and 14,000 turns per day to earn your meals. Yes, you read that correctly. You had to turn a crank thousands of times just to get your daily food ration. Some cranks were connected to paddles turning in sand or gravel, providing resistance. Some were connected to fans that moved air but accomplished nothing useful. And here's where the term screw as slang for a prison guard comes from. The guards had the ability to adjust the tension on the crank mechanism. They could literally screw it tighter, making it harder to turn. If a guard didn't like you, or if you'd broken a rule, or sometimes just for entertainment, they'd tighten your crank. Suddenly, what was already exhausting work became nearly impossible, but you still had to complete your turns to eat. So you kept cranking, your arm muscles screaming, sweat pouring down your face, knowing that some guard was probably laughing about it. The psychological effect of the crank was similar to the treadwheel. It was work that produced nothing. You'd spend hours turning this handle, achieving nothing, creating nothing, going nowhere. Just like the wheel, just like so much of Victorian prison labour, it was designed to crush your spirit while breaking your body. Then there was oakum picking. We touched on this briefly earlier, but let me give you the full terrible picture. Oakum is the fibre that comes from old rope. Ships used oakum mixed with tar to seal the gaps between planks in their hulls, making them waterproof. To get oakum, you had to unravel old rope, separating it fibre by fibre until you had loose strands. Sounds simple, right? Tedious, but simple. Except the rope used for oakum picking was old rope from ships. Rope that had been soaked in seawater, dried by sun, coated in tar, used for years until it was ready to be scrapped. This rope was stiff, hard. The fibres didn't want to separate. You had to use your hands to pull and tear and twist, working your fingers into the tightly wound strands and forcing them apart. Within hours, your fingertips would be raw. By the end of the first day, they'd be bleeding. The tar would get into the cuts, making them burn. Your hands would cramp from the constant gripping and pulling, but you couldn't stop. Prisoners were given a daily quota of oakum to pick. If you didn't meet your quota, you didn't get your full meal. And if you complained, if you showed your bleeding hands to a guard and asked for mercy, well, that might earn you extra punishment for insubordination. Women prisoners often did oakum picking as their primary labour. They'd sit in large rooms, dozens of them in silence, because remember, talking was forbidden, their hands constantly moving, fingers bloody, pulling apart these old ropes hour after hour. Some women picked oakum every day for years. Their hands would become permanently deformed, fingers bent and scarred, a visible mark of their imprisonment that they'd carry for the rest of their lives. At least oakum had a purpose. The picked fibre was sold and used, but that small bit of meaning didn't make the work any less painful or soul-destroying. Imagine spending your entire day, every day, doing something that hurts you, that you're forced to do, that earns you nothing except the privilege of eating minimal food and continuing to exist in a cell. The shot drill was another favourite. Shot means cannonballs, the heavy iron spheres used in artillery. In the shot drill, prisoners would stand in a line in the prison yard. Each prisoner would pick up a cannonball, which could weigh anywhere from 16 to 32 pounds, lift it to their chest, carry it to the far end of the yard, set it down, walk back, pick up another cannonball and repeat, over and over for hours. The balls were heavy, your arms would tire quickly, your back would ache from the constant bending to lift and set down the weights, and the purpose, there was none. You were just moving cannonballs from one end of a yard to the other. Sometimes, once you'd moved all the balls to one end, you'd be ordered to move them all back, the same balls, to the same place they started. It was Sisyphean, an endless cycle of pointless effort that existed only to exhaust you. Oxford Castle Prison had its own special form of labour, the capstan. You know how ships have that large vertical wheel that sailors would walk around to raise the anchor? Oxford Prison had one of these installed at the base of St. George's Tower, but instead of raising an anchor, it pumped water from the castle mill stream into a water tank on an upper floor. This water then supplied the prison's laundry and other facilities. 16 men would be strapped to the 8 spokes of the capstan, 2 men per spoke, and they'd walk, around and around in circles, pushing the heavy wheel, pumping water up the tower. At least this labour served a purpose. The prison needed water, but that didn't make it any less exhausting. You'd walk in circles for hours, the strap digging into your chest, your legs burning, dizzy from the constant turning. And if you slowed down, the men strapped with you would suffer too because the load would shift to them. So you kept walking, kept pushing, kept turning that wheel. The philosophy behind all this labour was explicit. The Victorians weren't hiding their intentions. They wanted to crush the spirit of inmates. That phrase appears in official documents, in prison reform debates, in the writings of prison administrators. They believed that criminals had to be broken down completely before they could be rebuilt. The hard labour was designed to be so exhausting, so meaningless, so degrading, that prisoners would lose all resistance. They'd become docile, obedient, willing to do anything to avoid returning to prison. Did it work? Well, that depends on what you mean by work. Did it make people suffer? Absolutely. Did it exhaust them physically and mentally? Without question. Did it reform them into better citizens who wouldn't commit crimes again? That's much less clear. What it definitely did was create a population of former prisoners who were physically broken, often with permanent injuries, and who had learned that work itself was a form of torture. Not exactly the outcome society was hoping for, and all of this labour was conducted in silence. Remember the silence system we discussed? It applied during work too. You couldn't talk to your fellow prisoners on the treadwheel. You couldn't commiserate with someone picking oakum next to you. You couldn't sing or hum or make any sound to pass the time and make the work bearable. Guards would patrol constantly, listening for any violation of the silence rule. If they caught you speaking even a single word, you'd face punishment, reduced food rations, time in a dark cell, sometimes flogging. Can you imagine it? Doing this brutal, meaningless work, your body screaming in pain and not even being able to share a word of complaint or encouragement with the person suffering next to you? The combination of hard labor and enforced silence created an atmosphere of such profound misery that it's hard for us, in our comfortable modern world, to truly comprehend. The treadwheel was finally banned in 1902. After 60 years of crushing prisoners' bodies and spirits, someone finally said enough. But the other forms of hard labor continued for decades longer. Oakum picking, stone breaking, the crank, all of these persisted well into the 20th century. Hard labor as a formal punishment wasn't officially abolished in Britain until 1948. 1948. That's less than 80 years ago, within living memory. Think about that. While the modern world was developing cars and airplanes, while we were splitting atoms and inventing computers, British prisons were still forcing people to turn cranks that did nothing and pick apart old rope until their hands bled. The Victorian punishments we're discussing tonight aren't ancient history, they're disturbingly recent. And here's something that might surprise you. The men and women subjecting prisoners to these punishments weren't necessarily sadists. Most prison guards were just ordinary people doing a job. A difficult, poorly paid, often dangerous job. They were following orders, implementing a system that society had decided was appropriate. That's perhaps the most disturbing part. This wasn't the work of a few cruel individuals. This was systematic, planned, approved by Parliament and supported by the public. The torture was official policy. The hard labour, combined with the isolation and silence, created a perfect storm of human suffering. Your body was exhausted. Your mind was starved for stimulation and human connection. Your spirit was crushed by the meaninglessness of your existence. Day after day, week after week, month after month, you climbed wheels that went nowhere, turned cranks that produced nothing, picked at rope until your hands were permanently damaged, all while surrounded by silence and stone walls. But as terrible as the labour was, as crushing as the silence was, there was still more to the Victorian prison experience that we haven't explored yet. Because while all this was happening to you, while you were broken and exhausted and isolated, there was a system of rules governing every moment of your existence. Rules about when you woke, when you ate, when you worked, when you slept. Rules about how you stood, how you walked, how you held your head. The entire prison operated like a machine, and you were just a cog in that machine, expected to function precisely as designed, without thought, without complaint, without any trace of your individuality remaining. So now that we understand the silence and the labour, it's time to understand the system itself, the daily routine that governed every waking moment, the schedule that turned human beings into clockwork automatons, because the Victorians didn't just want to punish you, they wanted to control you. Completely. Absolutely. Right down to the very rhythm of your heartbeat. The bell. Everything in a Victorian prison began and ended with the bell. Not the cheerful ringing of church bells on Sunday morning, or the gentle chime of a clock in a comfortable home. No, this was a harsh, metallic clang that cut through stone walls and invaded your dreams. 6:20 in the morning, the warning bell, 6:30, the rising bell. And from that moment until 9 o'clock at night when the lights went out, every minute of your existence was accounted for, planned, controlled. You became less a human being and more a component in a vast machine designed to run with perfect precision. Let me walk you through a typical day in the life of a Victorian prisoner in the 1880s, because understanding the routine, the absolute regimentation of every moment, is key to understanding how these places worked, how they reduced individuals to numbers, souls to schedules, lives to an endless repetition of the same joyless tasks. 6:20 in the morning. The warning bell rings through the prison. If you're a light sleeper, this wakes you. If you're not, you have 10 minutes before the real awakening. 10 minutes to drift in that space between sleep and waking, knowing what's coming, dreading it, but powerless to stop it. Those might be the only moments of the entire day that belong entirely to you. The only moments where you're not actively being controlled or observed or forced to do something. Cherish them. They won't last. 6:30. The rising bell. Immediately you hear the sound of metal on metal as warders move through the corridors, keys rattling against cell doors. The locks turn, the doors open, but not all at once. They do it in shifts, in organised waves, so prisoners don't all emerge at the same moment. Even something as simple as leaving your cell is controlled, timed, managed. Your cell door opens. You're already awake, of course. You've been lying on your wooden plank bed, thin mattress, barely providing any cushioning, rough blanket that's more scratching than warming. You sit up. You roll your bedding according to the exact specifications you've been taught. Not just rolled, folded in a particular way and placed in a particular spot. Everything has a place. Everything has a method. Deviation from the method brings punishment. You're given a bucket for your waste and a small basin of water. This water, this single basin, serves multiple purposes. First, you wash yourself. Your face, your hands, your body as best you can with minimal water and no soap, or maybe a tiny sliver of harsh soap that barely lathers. Then, when you're done washing yourself, you use that same water to clean your cell. Yes, the same water. The water you've just washed your body with is now your cleaning water for the stone floor, the wooden furniture, everything in your small domain. You scrub your cell until it meets the standards that will be inspected later. Every morning, the same routine, the same dirty water, the same small degradation. By 7 o'clock, the bells ring again. Time for chapel. Remember those separated stalls I described earlier? You shuffle to the chapel in single file, wearing a hood if you're in a prison that still practices strict separation, or simply keeping your head down and eyes forward if you're in a slightly more lenient institution. You enter your stall. The chaplain begins his sermon. This is mandatory. You cannot refuse to attend chapel. Even if you're not Christian, even if you're Jewish or Muslim or an atheist, you sit in that stall and you listen to a Christian chaplain tell you about sin and redemption and how you deserve your suffering because you broke God's law as well as man's law. The hymns are strange in these prisons. Imagine hundreds of isolated voices, each singing from their own wooden box, the sound merging, but the people never connecting. It's like hearing a choir of ghosts. The chaplain leads prayers for your souls, for your reformation, for your eventual return to society as productive, obedient citizens. Whether you want these prayers or not, whether you believe in them or not. Chapel lasts about 45 minutes. Then the bells ring again, and you return to your cell for breakfast. 7:45 or 8 o'clock, depending on the prison. Breakfast is brought to your cell by a prisoner assigned to serving duty, always under the watchful eye of a warder. What's for breakfast? Well, that depends on the prison and the era, but let me give you a typical menu. Bread. A chunk of bread, often quite hard, sometimes stale. The weight was carefully regulated, usually about 8 ounces, enough to keep you from starving but not enough to feel satisfied. With this bread, you might get a pint of gruel. Gruel is about as appetizing as it sounds. It's basically water with oatmeal or other grains boiled into it until it forms a thin, watery porridge. Sometimes there's a tiny bit of salt for flavour, sometimes there's nothing, just gruel, plain, tasteless, barely nourishing. If you're lucky, you might also get a small piece of cheese, maybe an ounce. Hard cheese that's been stored for who knows how long and tastes like salted rubber. But it's protein. And in a Victorian prison, you take what you can get. Some prisons gave cocoa to sick prisoners or as a special privilege. Most prisoners never tasted it. You eat this meal in your cell alone in silence. You have perhaps 20 minutes. Then the plates are collected and the next phase of your day begins. Work. The bells ring, 8:30 or 9 o'clock, time for labour. You might be taken to the treadwheel house. You might be led to a workshop for oakum picking. You might be assigned to your cell with a crank to turn. Wherever you go, whatever you do, silence is enforced. No talking, no humming, no singing, no sound except the sound of work. The clacking of the treadwheel, the scraping of rope fibres, the grinding of the crank. Hour after hour. These sounds become the soundtrack of your life, boring into your brain until you hear them even when you're trying to sleep. Around noon the bells ring again. Dinner time. This is the main meal of the day, though calling it main is generous. You return to your cell and your dinner is brought to you. What's on the menu? Let me paint you a picture of Victorian prison cuisine. Potatoes, boiled potatoes, maybe 3 or 4 of them, depending on size. These are often the small, least desirable potatoes, the ones that wouldn't sell at market. Boiled until they're soft, served plain. No butter, no salt, or maybe just a trace, just potatoes. With the potatoes you might get suet. Suet is hard animal fat, usually from around the kidneys of cattle or sheep. It's solid at room temperature, white or yellowish, and has a texture like candle wax. It's high in calories, which is why prison served it. But it's not what anyone would call appetizing. You're supposed to eat this old, hard fat along with your potatoes. It sticks in your throat. It sits heavy in your stomach. But it's food, and you're hungry, so you eat it. Sometimes, instead of suet, you'd get what prisoners called stirabout. This was a hated dish. Stirabout was made from cornmeal, oatmeal and salt boiled together into a thick, gluey paste. It was meant to be cheap and filling. It succeeded at cheap. The filling part was debatable. Stirabout had a texture like wallpaper paste and a taste like, well, like nothing really. Or like sadness, if sadness had a flavour. Prisoners despise stirabout. There are records of prisoners refusing to eat it and choosing to go hungry instead. But if you did that too often, you'd be punished for wasting food. A few prisons, the more progressive ones, occasionally served meat soup. Once a week maybe. A thin broth with tiny pieces of meat floating in it. More suggestion than substance. This was considered a privilege, a luxury even. That tells you something about how low the baseline was. You have 1 hour for dinner. You eat alone in your cell. Then the plates are collected and you return to work. 1 o'clock until 5 o'clock in the afternoon. 4 more hours of labour, 4 more hours of silence, 4 more hours of meaningless tasks that exhaust your body and numb your mind. The afternoon stretches endlessly, time moves differently when every moment is the same. When there's nothing to look forward to and nothing to remember except more of the same. 5 o'clock. The bells ring, supper time, back to your cell, what's for supper? Usually it's similar to breakfast, more bread, maybe another pint of gruel, sometimes a bit of cheese. This is your last meal of the day. Make it last because you won't eat again until breakfast the next morning. That's a gap of 13 hours or more with nothing in your stomach. After supper, you have a brief period, maybe an hour, where you're allowed to read. But the reading material is strictly controlled. The Bible, of course, religious tracts, maybe an improving book about morality or the dangers of sin. Nothing entertaining, nothing stimulating. Certainly nothing that might encourage independent thought or make you question the system holding you captive. The Victorians were very careful about what ideas they allowed into prisoners' minds. Then at 9 o'clock, the final bells of the day. Lights out, candles extinguished, darkness. You lie on your hard bed, pull your thin blanket over yourself and try to sleep. In the darkness, the prison is never truly silent. You hear coughs from other cells, muffled sounds that somehow penetrate the thick walls. You hear the footsteps of warders on patrol checking cells, ensuring everyone is where they should be. You hear the wind outside, the rain if it's storming, and these sounds remind you that there's a world out there, a world of warmth and light and people who can talk to each other freely, a world you're no longer part of, and then you sleep if you can, and when you wake, the bells will ring again, 6:20, 6:30, and the entire day will repeat. Exactly the same wash water, the same chapel service, the same tasteless food, the same silent labour, the same crushing routine, day after day, week after week, month after month, for some prisoners year after year. Now here's something that might surprise you. Sunday was different. Sunday was the only day prisoners didn't work. You'd think this would be a relief, a blessing, a break from the monotonous horror of the regular schedule. But many prisoners actually found Sundays to be the hardest day of the week. Why? Because on Sunday, you had nothing to do, nothing to distract you from your thoughts, nothing to occupy your mind. The day started an hour later, at 7 o'clock instead of 6:30. Small mercy. But then instead of going to work, you went to chapel twice, once in the morning, once in the afternoon. Longer services than on weekdays, with more sermons, more prayers, more hymns sung from isolated stalls. Between the two services, you were locked in your cell with nothing to do except read the Bible or sit in silence. Exercise was allowed, usually an hour in the afternoon. Walking alone in your wedge of the exercise yard, while the sky moved overhead and reminded you of freedom, for many prisoners, especially those who were illiterate or who found reading difficult, Sunday was torture. At least during the week, the labour gave you something to focus on, even if it was painful and pointless. Sunday gave you nothing but time. Time to think about what you'd lost, time to worry about your family, time to count the days remaining in your sentence if you could keep track, time to feel the full weight of your situation pressing down on you like the stone walls themselves. But here's the truly insidious part of this system. It wasn't designed to be merely punishing, it was designed to be reforming. The Victorians genuinely believed that this routine, this absolute control over every aspect of your life, would make you a better person. They believed that by stripping away your autonomy, by reducing you to a number following orders, by isolating you and working you and feeding you barely enough to survive, they were teaching you discipline, teaching you obedience, teaching you to respect authority and law. Did it work? Well, that's complicated. For some prisoners, especially first-time offenders who came from relatively stable backgrounds, the horror of prison was enough to ensure they never wanted to return. They'd do anything, endure anything to avoid going back to that bell-ruled existence. But for many others, especially those from the desperate poverty we discussed earlier, prison just confirmed what they already knew, that society saw them as less than human, that they had no value except as objects to be controlled and punished, that the world outside wasn't much better than the world inside, just less organized about its cruelty. And then there were the prisoners who broke under the system, who couldn't handle the routine, the isolation, the meaninglessness of it all. These prisoners, we'll talk more about them soon, the ones who heard voices, the ones who saw things that weren't there, the ones who believed the food was poisoned or the walls were closing in, the ones who tried to harm themselves just to feel something, anything other than the numbing emptiness of another identical day. The Victorian prison routine was a machine designed to process human beings. Input, criminal; output, reformed citizen. But machines only work if the raw materials are what you expect, and human beings, it turns out, are not raw materials. We're complex, fragile, infinitely variable. We break in unexpected ways. We resist in small, quiet ways. We find meaning in places the designers never intended. Or we shatter completely beyond any hope of repair. Every day, thousands of prisoners lived this routine across England. In Pentonville and Millbank, in Reading and Oxford, in Manchester and Birmingham and Liverpool. Thousands of people waking to bells, eating tasteless food, working in silence, sleeping in darkness, and waking to do it all again. This was justice. This was reform. This was what Victorian society decided was the appropriate response to crime. Not rehabilitation in any meaningful sense. Not education or skill building or addressing the poverty that drove so many to crime in the first place. Just control. Just routine. Just the endless crushing repetition of a system that valued order above everything, including humanity. As we move forward in our journey through these Victorian prisons, we're going to encounter something that challenges our understanding even further. Because while all these men were living through this routine, there were also women in the system. Women facing different challenges, different horrors, different forms of degradation. The Victorian prison experience wasn't uniform across gender. Women prisoners faced all the same punishments we've discussed. But they also faced additional burdens, additional cruelties specific to being female in a system designed primarily for men. And their stories, their suffering deserves its own attention. Because what happened to women in Victorian prisons was, in some ways, even more heartbreaking than what happened to the men, and that's saying something. A woman's scream echoes through stone corridors, but it's muffled, distant, as though the walls themselves are trying to swallow the sound. In a cell somewhere, a mother is being told that her children have been taken to the workhouse. She'll never see them again. In another wing, a young woman sits with bleeding hands from hours of oakum picking, wondering if the baby growing inside her will survive the prison diet. And in a third-floor cell, an elderly woman who stole a loaf of bread to feed her grandchildren stares at the wall, having given up on speaking altogether, because what's the point of words when no one listens? Welcome to the hidden side of Victorian imprisonment. The women behind bars. Their suffering was the same as men's in many ways, the same silence, the same hard labour, the same crushing routine. But it was also profoundly different, because being a woman in a Victorian prison meant facing additional layers of punishment, additional forms of cruelty that had nothing to do with your crime, and everything to do with your gender. Let me take you into their world. And I warn you now, some of these stories are going to be difficult to hear, but they deserve to be heard. They deserve to be remembered. Millbank Prison in London was one of the largest institutions housing female prisoners. It operated from 1821 to 1886, a massive complex on the Thames that could hold over 1,000 inmates at its peak. Walking into the women's section of Millbank would have been a distinctly different experience from entering a men's prison. Not better, mind you, just different. The sounds were different. Women's voices, even when whispering in violation of the silence rule, have a different quality. The desperation sounds different, the grief sounds different. The first thing to understand about women in Victorian prisons is that they were punished not just for their crimes, but for violating Victorian ideals of femininity. A woman was supposed to be gentle, obedient, domestic, pure. A woman who committed a crime had therefore failed at being a woman. She wasn't just a criminal, she was a fallen woman, and the prison system treated her accordingly, with a mixture of punishment and patronizing attempts to teach her proper feminine behavior. The crimes that sent women to prison were often different from men's crimes. Yes, there were women who committed violent offences or major thefts, but the majority of women prisoners were there for what we might call survival crimes. Stealing food, stealing clothing, prostitution, being drunk and disorderly. Many were desperately poor, trying to survive in a world that offered women very few legal ways to earn money, especially if they were uneducated or had children to care for. Let me tell you about a real woman whose story is preserved in prison records. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and she was arrested in London in 1853. Her crime? Stealing 2 yards of cloth from a draper's shop. The cloth was worth about 3 shillings. Sarah was 28 years old, married to a man who had abandoned her, and she had 4 children under the age of 8. The cloth was to make clothes for her youngest, who had outgrown everything she owned. Sarah was sentenced to 6 months in Millbank. When she entered the prison, her children were taken from her immediately. The 2 oldest, ages 7 and 8, were sent to a workhouse. The 2 youngest, still needing care, were sent to a foundling hospital. Sarah never saw any of them again. After her release, she tried to find them, but the workhouse had no record of where they'd been sent, and the foundling hospital refused to give her information. Her children, for all practical purposes, had been erased. This wasn't unusual. This was standard procedure. When a woman with children was imprisoned, those children became the problem of whatever parish or charity institution would take them. Sometimes siblings were split up and sent to different places. Sometimes they died in the workhouses or orphanages, and their mothers were never informed. The separation of mothers from children was considered part of the punishment. You committed a crime? Well, now you lose your children. That'll teach you. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine not just losing your freedom, but losing your children and not knowing if they're safe, if they're being cared for, if they're even alive, and all for stealing 2 yards of cloth to dress a child? The psychological torture of this separation was immense. Prison records are full of women who became despondent, who stopped eating, who had what the Victorians called nervous breakdowns worrying about their children. And the prison authorities saw this as weakness, as proof that these women were unfit mothers anyway. The work assigned to female prisoners was, unsurprisingly, gendered. While men climbed treadwheels and turned cranks, women were given appropriate female tasks: sewing, washing, cleaning, making prison uniforms, doing laundry for the male prisoners and staff. It was still hard labour, still exhausting, still conducted in silence. But it was labour that reinforced Victorian ideas about women's proper role. Laundry work in a Victorian prison was brutal. Imagine spending your entire day bent over washing tubs filled with cold or lukewarm water, scrubbing prison uniforms and linens by hand with harsh lye soap that destroyed your skin. Your hands would be perpetually raw, cracked, bleeding. The soap would get into the cracks and burn. The steam from the hot water when you boiled the linens would leave your face flushed and your lungs feeling heavy. You'd wring out sheets and uniforms by hand, the wet fabric heavy and resistant, your arms aching from the constant twisting motion. 8 hours, 10 hours, however long it took to complete the day's washing, all in silence. And oakum picking, which we discussed earlier, was particularly common for female prisoners. Women would sit in large rooms, sometimes 50 or 60 of them together, but forbidden from speaking, their fingers working at the old tarred rope, blood eventually mixing with the tar. The women who did this work for years developed distinctive hands, fingers that wouldn't fully straighten, permanent calluses, scars from where the rope had cut deeply. These hands mark them as former prisoners for the rest of their lives. Good luck finding work as a seamstress or domestic servant with hands like that. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of women's imprisonment was the vulnerability it created. Victorian prisons were run almost entirely by men. Male governors, male warders, male chaplains, male doctors. Yes, there were some female matrons to supervise the women prisoners directly, but they were always outnumbered and subordinate to male authority. This created an environment where abuse was not just possible, but tragically common. Historical records, when they exist, hint at this. Official complaints were rare because who would a woman prisoner complain to? The system was stacked against her. But occasionally scandals would break. A warder dismissed for inappropriate conduct with female prisoners. A chaplain reassigned after rumours of improper touching during confession. A doctor investigated for examining women prisoners more frequently and intimately than medical necessity required. These were the cases that made it into official records. How many more went unreported, unrecorded, hidden by a system that valued order and reputation over the safety of the women in its care? Pregnancy in prison was its own special horror. Some women entered prison already pregnant. Some became pregnant in prison, either through consensual relationships with male staff, which was supposed to be impossible but happened anyway, or through assault, which was also supposed to be impossible and definitely happened. Pregnant women received no special treatment. You did your work until you physically couldn't. You ate the same inadequate diet. You slept on the same hard bed. When the time came to give birth, you were usually moved to the prison infirmary, a slightly less horrible room, but still a far cry from any kind of comfortable or sanitary birthing environment. The prison doctor would deliver your baby with whatever medical knowledge he possessed, which might be considerable or might be minimal. Women died in childbirth in these prisons. Babies died within days of being born, and if both mother and child survived, what then? In some prisons, mothers were allowed to keep their infants with them in their cells for a few months. Imagine trying to care for a newborn in a 13 by 7 foot cell with minimal heat, inadequate food, and no one to help you. Your baby cries, and you're terrified because crying might disturb the warders, might bring punishment. Your baby needs more milk than your malnourished body can produce, and there's no alternative available. You watch your child weaken, and you're powerless to help. Eventually, if the baby survived those first few months, it would be taken away, sent to an orphanage or workhouse, another child lost to the system. There were women who tried to resist, who fought against the system in whatever small ways they could. Let me tell you about Catherine Doyle. She's mentioned in the book Victorian Convicts 100 Criminal Lives, and her story is illuminating. Catherine was born in Manchester in 1851. At 16 years old, she was sentenced to 7 days in prison for stealing a jacket. Just 7 days, but the brief taste of imprisonment apparently taught her nothing about staying out of trouble. A year later, she was back for a similar offence. Then at 18, Catherine stole some wool. With her previous convictions counting against her, the judge sentenced her to 7 years in custody, followed by 7 years of police supervision. 7 years for stealing wool. She was sent to Millbank Prison in London, then transferred to Fulham Prison. And Catherine Doyle did not go quietly into that good night. She destroyed prison property. She was disorderly. She refused to comply with rules. The prison staff punished her with reduced food rations and restrained her in a straitjacket when she became too troublesome. Was Catherine a difficult person? Probably. Was she also a teenager ripped from her life and thrown into a horrific system for the crime of being poor and desperate? Absolutely. Her resistance, her refusal to be broken, came at a cost. More punishment, more isolation, more suffering. But in its own way, it was also a form of dignity, a refusal to let the system completely erase who she was. Catherine continued this pattern for much of her life, in and out of prison, never quite reformed, never quite broken. Her story is tragic, but it's also, in a strange way, inspiring. She never gave up being herself, even when everything and everyone was trying to force her into compliance. Now, Let's talk about a group of women who are imprisoned for something that, in hindsight, seems absolutely absurd: the suffragettes. In the early 1900s, women fighting for the right to vote were arrested and imprisoned, often at Holloway Prison in London. These weren't poor women stealing bread. These were educated, often middle-class or upper-class women who deliberately broke laws as part of their political campaign. They smashed windows, they chained themselves to railings, they disrupted political meetings, and they were sent to prison for it. The suffragettes in prison adopted a tactic that terrified the authorities: the hunger strike. They refused to eat, using their own bodies as weapons against the system. And the prison authorities responded with something that still shocks us today: forced feeding. Women who refused to eat were held down by warders, sometimes 5 or 6 people holding one struggling woman. A tube would be forced down her throat or up her nose, and liquid food would be poured directly into her stomach. This wasn't a medical procedure done with care. This was violence. Women described choking, gagging, vomiting, feeling like they were drowning. The tube sometimes caused injuries, tearing tissue in the nose or throat. Women who endured multiple forced feedings suffered psychological trauma that lasted for years, and yet many of them went right back to their political activism after being released, knowing they might be arrested again, knowing they might face forced feeding again. That takes a kind of courage that's difficult to comprehend. The contrast between how suffragettes were treated and how poor women criminals were treated is instructive. The suffragettes had public support, or at least public attention. Their treatment was documented, protested, debated in Parliament. When a suffragette died in prison, it made national news. But when Sarah Mitchell lost her children, when Catherine Doyle was restrained in a straitjacket, when unnamed women suffered abuse from prison staff, there were no headlines. No public outcry, no parliamentary debates. They were just criminals, fallen women, people who didn't matter to Victorian society. Their suffering was invisible, acceptable, part of the natural order of things. Elizabeth Fry deserves mention here. She was one of the first prison reformers to focus specifically on women prisoners. In the early 1800s, she began visiting Newgate Prison in London and was horrified by what she found. Women and children crammed together in terrible conditions, no work to occupy them, no education, no hope of reform or rehabilitation. Fry started programs to teach women prisoners to read and to do needlework. She advocated for female warders to supervise female prisoners. She pushed for separate facilities for women. Her work had some impact, but it was limited. The fundamental problem was that Victorian society saw women criminals as beyond redemption in a way that men criminals weren't. A man who stole could theoretically be reformed, could become a productive worker again. But a woman who stole had violated her essential nature. She had failed at being feminine, at being pure, at being the moral guardian of her home that Victorian ideology said women should be. How do you reform someone who's failed at their very essence? The Victorians never really figured that out, so they just punished, hoping that somehow through suffering these women would transform into acceptable versions of femininity. The mortality rate for women in Victorian prisons was significant. Disease spread easily in crowded conditions. Tuberculosis was rampant. Typhoid fever, cholera during outbreaks. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making prisoners vulnerable to any illness that made its way through the population. Women who are already weak from poverty and malnutrition before imprisonment often didn't survive long sentences, and when they died, they were buried in unmarked graves in prison cemeteries, forgotten by everyone except perhaps the families who would never know exactly what happened to them. Yet through all of this, through the separation from children, the gendered labour, the vulnerability to abuse, the inadequate food and medical care, the constant degradation and punishment, many women survived. They found small ways to maintain their humanity. They whispered encouragement to each other when the warders weren't listening. They shared food from their meagre rations with women who were weaker. They sang softly at night, quiet enough not to bring punishment, but loud enough to remind each other that they weren't completely alone. These small acts of resistance and solidarity weren't enough to change the system, but they were enough to keep some women sane, to give them something to hold on to in the darkness. As we prepare to move into the next part of our journey, I want you to hold on to something. The women we've discussed tonight, Sarah and Catherine and the unnamed thousands like them, they weren't so different from women today. They loved their children. They wanted security and safety. They made desperate choices in impossible situations. But Victorian society saw them as fundamentally flawed, as criminals who deserved not just punishment but erasure. Their stories were meant to be forgotten, their suffering invisible. But they were real people. They mattered. And now, more than a century later, we're remembering them. Next, we're going to look at another group whose suffering was meant to be invisible. Children. Because yes, Victorian prisons held children, some as young as 7 or 8 years old, children who were tried as adults, sentenced as adults, and thrown into this same brutal system we've been exploring. And what happened to those children? Well, that's a story that's going to break your heart even more than what we've already discussed. Because if adults couldn't survive this system without being damaged, what chance did children have? Small hands reaching through iron bars, a voice that hasn't finished changing yet, crying out in the dark, the sound of a whip striking a back that's still growing. These images should horrify us. They should seem impossible, relics from a barbaric age we've long since left behind. But they're not ancient history, they're Victorian England. And the children who suffered through the prison system weren't criminals in any meaningful sense. They were survivors trying to stay alive in a world that had no place for them. A world that, when they stumbled, locked them up alongside murderers and thieves and treated them with the same brutal efficiency it used on adults. Let me tell you a story. It's 1848, and there's a boy named George Brasher standing in front of a magistrate. George is 11 years old. He's being charged with larceny, which is just a fancy legal word for theft. What did he steal? The records show it was food. Bread, probably. Maybe some cheese. The kind of thing an 11-year-old boy steals when he's hungry and has no other options. The magistrate looks at George's record. This isn't his first offence. George has been arrested before multiple times. The magistrate makes his decision. Guilty. The sentence, whipping. George is taken to a room in the courthouse. His shirt is removed. He's bent over a bench or perhaps made to grip a post. And then a grown man, probably twice George's size, raises a leather strap or a birch rod and begins to strike this child across the back. How many strokes? The records don't always specify, but typical sentences were 12 to 24 strokes. Imagine that. Imagine being 11 years old and being beaten by an adult employed by the state to do exactly that. The pain, the humiliation, the terror. And then being released back onto the same streets, with the same lack of food and shelter, with the same desperation that drove you to steal in the first place. This was justice for children in Victorian England. And when whipping wasn't enough, when the offences kept happening or became more serious, the next step was prison. Real prison. The same prisons we've been discussing, with the same silence rules and hard labour and isolation. Except you're not an adult. You're a child. Maybe you're 7 years old, maybe you're 10, maybe you're 14 and already so hardened by life that you seem older. But you're still just a child. Here's something that's going to shock you. In early Victorian prisons, before the reforms of the mid-1800s, children weren't separated from adult prisoners. They were all mixed together. A 7-year-old boy arrested for pickpocketing might be in the same cell as a 40-year-old man convicted of violent assault. A 12-year-old girl caught stealing might share space with adult female prisoners who had committed serious crimes. The rationale, such as it was that prisons had limited space and limited resources. Segregating prisoners by age would be expensive and complicated, so they just didn't bother. What do you think happened in that environment? Children were victimized, obviously. Physically, sexually, psychologically. They were dominated by adult prisoners, used, abused, taught things no child should know, the very thing the Victorian prison system claimed to prevent, the corruption of first-time offenders by hardened criminals, was happening to children on a massive scale, and the authorities knew about it. There are records of investigations, reports, hand-wringing about the problem, but real change came slowly. So slowly. Let me take you deeper into George Brasher's story, because it gets worse. George's father had been convicted of theft years earlier and transported to Tasmania, then called Van Diemen's Land, on a convict ship named Tortoise in 1842. He never returned after his sentence. George's father simply disappeared into the Australian penal colonies, leaving behind a wife and children with no support. George's mother tried to hold the family together, but poverty is a vicious thing. It eats away at everything. Young George turned to theft to survive. He was caught, whipped, released, caught again, whipped again, released again. The pattern repeated. In 1848, when he was still just a child, he was sentenced to 6 months in prison. 6 months for a child. During those 6 months, while George was locked up, his mother collapsed and died in the street. The historical record describes her as being drained by the label of a transported convict's wife and exasperated by her sons, all of whom were convicted felons. She literally died of the stress and shame and exhaustion of trying to survive in a society that had criminalized poverty. George came out of prison to find his mother dead. No father. No family support. What do you think happened next? More theft, more arrests, more punishment. George Brasher's entire childhood was a cycle of crime, punishment and desperation, created and sustained by a system that saw him not as a child in need of help, but as a criminal in need of correction. And there were thousands of Georges, thousands of children ground up by Victorian society's machinery of punishment. But Victorian reformers eventually started to realize that maybe, just maybe, throwing children in prison with adult criminals wasn't producing the desired results. Maybe it was actually making things worse. Revolutionary thinking, I know. So they started developing alternatives. First came reformatory schools, established in the mid-1800s. Reformatory schools were meant to be a middle ground between prison and freedom. Children who committed minor crimes, theft being the most common, could be sent to these institutions instead of adult prisons. The idea was that reformatories would teach children useful skills while also instilling discipline and moral values. Boys would learn trades, how to use machinery, carpentry, metalwork, skills that would make them employable when they left. Girls would learn domestic skills, cooking, cleaning, sewing, preparing them for lives as servants or wives. Sounds almost reasonable, doesn't it? But let's look at what reformatory schools were actually like. The discipline was severe. Children could be beaten for infractions. They could have their hair cut off as punishment, a public shaming that marked them as troublemakers. They could be placed in solitary confinement, locked in small rooms alone, sometimes for days. Yes, the same solitary confinement that was driving adult prisoners insane was also used on children. 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, locked in the dark alone with their fears, as punishment for talking during lessons or failing to complete their work properly. The daily routine in reformatory schools was strict. Wake early, prayer, breakfast, lessons or work, lunch, more lessons or work, prayer, supper, bed. Everything scheduled, everything controlled, everything designed to break the child's will and replace it with obedience. The Victorians called this education. They called it reform, but what it really was institutionalized control, an attempt to force poor children into shapes that middle-class Victorian society found acceptable. And the work these children did was often exploitative. Reformatory schools funded themselves partly through the labour of their inmates. Boys might work in prison workshops making products that were sold. Girls might do laundry or sewing that brought in income. The children weren't paid, of course. Their labour was considered part of their punishment and reform. So these institutions were essentially using child labour while claiming to be helping the children. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. Then came Borstals, introduced later in the Victorian era, and more fully developed in the early 1900s. Borstals were specifically for young offenders, typically teenagers. The name comes from the village of Borstal in Kent, where the first of these institutions was established. Borstals were supposed to be more progressive than reformatory schools, focusing on education and rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. But the reality was that Borstals were still prisons. Harsh discipline, strict routines, hard physical labour. The main difference was that Borstals tried to teach young offenders a trade, giving them some kind of skill they could use after release. But the underlying philosophy was the same. These young people were seen as problems to be managed, threats to be neutralised rather than children and teenagers who needed support and opportunity. Throughout all of this, Victorian society maintained a fascinating double standard. When middle-class or upper-class children misbehaved, it was seen as youthful high spirit, something they'd grow out of with proper guidance. But when poor children broke the law, even when they were stealing to eat, it was seen as evidence of moral deficiency. Evidence that they were born bad and needed to be punished until they learned to be good. The idea that poverty itself might be the problem, that children can't make good choices when all their choices are terrible, this didn't seem to occur to most Victorians, or if it did occur to them, they chose to ignore it. There's a particularly cruel irony in Victorian attitudes toward working-class children. On one hand, society relied on child labour. Poor children worked in factories, in mines, as chimney sweeps, in domestic service. They worked long hours in dangerous conditions for minimal pay. This was considered normal, acceptable, even necessary. But if those same children, desperate and hungry, stole something to survive, suddenly they were criminals who needed to be locked up and punished. You can work 12 hours a day in a factory at age 8. That's fine, but steal a loaf of bread and you're a criminal. The Education Act of 1876 tried to address part of this problem by making school attendance compulsory for children up to age 12. The thinking was that if children were in school, they wouldn't be on the streets committing crimes. But schoolrooms in poor neighbourhoods were often harsh places, overcrowded, under-resourced, teachers who were overworked and sometimes brutal. Children who misbehaved could be caned, struck with a wooden rod across their hands or backsides. They could be made to stand in corners for hours. They could be placed in solitary confinement, yes, even in schools, locked in small rooms as punishment. Some schools even had what they called reformatory rooms, or punishment rooms, that were essentially cells. A child who repeatedly misbehaved might be locked in one of these rooms for the entire school day, sitting alone in the dark while their classmates learned their lessons in the next room. The idea was to make the child reflect on their behaviour and choose to do better. Sound familiar? It's the same philosophy that drove the separate system in adult prisons. Isolation leads to reflection, leads to reformation. Except it didn't work for adults, and it certainly didn't work for children. Reading Jail, a famous Victorian prison built in 1844, held both adults and young people. Oscar Wilde would later be imprisoned there, but that's another story. Before reforms separated juvenile offenders, Reading held children as young as 8 or 9 years old. These children followed the same routine as adult prisoners, same solence rules, same hard labour, though perhaps adjusted slightly for their size, same isolation, same punishment for infractions. Imagine being 9 years old and being told you're not allowed to speak. Not for days, not for weeks, not for months. You're a child. Your brain is still developing. You need social interaction, play, conversation. These things aren't luxuries for children, they're necessities. Take them away, and you damage the child's development in ways that might never be repaired. But the Victorians didn't understand child psychology the way we do now, or perhaps they understood it and simply didn't care. Either way, the result was the same: damaged children who grew into damaged adults. One particularly heartbreaking detail from historical records. In some prisons that held children, the exercise yards had markings painted on the ground. Children were supposed to walk in these marked paths during their exercise hour, keeping a certain distance from each other. Not speaking, not playing, just walking. Walking in circles like the adults, like prisoners, because that's what they were, even though their crimes were often nothing more than trying to survive. There were a few voices of dissent. Some reformers argued that children shouldn't be imprisoned at all, that society had a duty to care for poor children rather than punish them. But these voices were in the minority. Most Victorians believed that punishment was necessary, that children needed to learn consequences for their actions, and that being soft on juvenile crime would only create more criminals in the future. So the system continued. Children continued to be arrested, beaten, imprisoned, broken. Here's a question worth considering. What happens to a child who grows up in this system? A child who's been whipped by officials, locked in solitary confinement, forced to work in silence, taught that adults are threats and that society sees them as worthless criminals. What kind of adult does that child become? The Victorians wanted these children to emerge as law-abiding, productive citizens, but more often they emerged as deeply damaged people who had learned that violence is how problems are solved, that authority is to be feared and resented, and that they have no value except as objects to be controlled. The cycle perpetuated itself. Children raised in the prison system often ended up back in the prison system as adults. Their own children then grew up in poverty without parental support and ended up in the same institutions. Generation after generation trapped in a cycle of poverty and punishment that society had created and then blamed on the individuals caught in it. But amazingly, some children survived. Some even thrived. There are stories of young people who went through reformatory schools and genuinely learned trades that gave them opportunities, who found mentors among the staff who actually cared about them, who discovered resilience within themselves that carried them through. These success stories were used by Victorian society to justify the whole system. See? It works! Look at this child who turned their life around. But for every one success story, there were dozens or hundreds of failures, of children who emerged more damaged than when they entered, of children who didn't emerge at all because they died in these institutions. Child mortality in Victorian prisons and reformatories was significant. Disease spread easily among children living in close quarters with inadequate nutrition. Tuberculosis, typhoid, cholera during outbreaks. Accidents happened during hard labour. Some children died by suicide, unable to bear the conditions they were living in. And when they died, they were buried in unmarked graves, their short lives reduced to a number in a register, if that. As we move forward, we need to understand that the Victorian prison system wasn't just about punishing criminals. It was about social control, about keeping the lower classes in their place, about teaching children, especially poor children, that they had no power, no rights, no future except what society chose to give them. And one of the ways Victorian society enforced this control was through a practice that seems almost incomprehensible today. Transportation, taking criminals, including many who were barely adults, and shipping them to the other side of the world, to Australia, to a land so far away that they might as well be dead for all their families would ever see them again. And that journey, that voyage on convict ships to a penal colony on the edge of the known world, that was its own unique form of hell. A hell we're about to explore in detail. The smell of salt water mixed with human misery, the creak of wooden boards beneath your feet, the endless rolling of waves that makes your stomach turn even when you've had nothing to eat, chains around your ankles, connecting you to dozens of other prisoners below deck in a space so cramped you can't stand upright. Above you, the footsteps of sailors going about their work. Around you, the sounds of people being sick, people crying, people praying in languages you don't understand. And ahead of you, months of this. Months of sailing toward a destination so far away that it exists only as a name on a map. Australia, Van Diemen's Land, New South Wales. Places that might as well be the moon, for how likely you are to ever return home. Welcome to transportation, the Victorian solution to overcrowded prisons and expensive executions. If criminals were such a problem in England, why not simply send them away? Ship them to the other side of the world where they could work in penal colonies and in theory build new lives. It sounds almost humane when you describe it that way. It wasn't. Transportation was exile. It was a death sentence without the death, at least not immediately. It was the erasure of everything and everyone you'd ever known, with only the slimmest chance of ever coming back. Between 1787 and 1868, over 160,000 people were transported from Britain to Australia. 160,000. That's not just a statistic. That's 160,000 individual human stories. 160,000 people torn from their families, loaded onto ships and sent to the far edge of the British Empire to labour under the Australian sun. Some of them were genuine criminals, dangerous people who probably needed to be removed from society. But many, probably both, were just poor people who'd committed survival crimes. Theft, poaching, fraud on a small scale, the kind of crimes born from desperation rather than malice. And here's the thing about transportation. The punishment didn't start when you arrived in Australia. It started the moment you were sentenced. Because between sentencing and departure you were held in prison, often for months, waiting for a ship to be ready. If you were lucky, you waited at Pentonville Prison, where at least the facilities were relatively new. If you were unlucky, you waited in older, more decrepit institutions. Either way, you waited in the separate system, in silence and isolation, knowing that soon you'd be leaving England forever. Pentonville Prison was specifically designed to serve as a preparatory institution for transportation. Prisoners spent 18 months there in solitary confinement, supposedly being reformed and prepared for their new lives in the colonies. The chaplains worked overtime, trying to instill proper religious and moral values. The prisoners were taught trades that might be useful in Australia, and their behaviour during these 18 months determined what kind of treatment they'd receive when they arrived. Good behaviour meant you might get a ticket of leave, which allowed you to work for wages and live relatively independently. Bad behaviour meant hard labour in chain gangs with no freedom at all. But here's what the chaplains and reformers at Pentonville didn't account for. 18 months of isolation does something to a person's mind. We've already discussed the mental breakdowns, the hallucinations, the prisoner's madness. Now imagine taking someone who's been driven to the edge of sanity by isolation and putting them on a ship with hundreds of other people. The psychological whiplash was intense. And the ship's surgeons, the doctors responsible for prisoners' health during the voyage, documented something strange. Prisoners from Pentonville suffered what they called hysteric fits, far more than prisoners from other institutions. These fits would come on suddenly, often within hours of boarding the ship. Men who'd been sorenant for 18 months would start screaming. They'd thrash against their chains. They'd weep uncontrollably. Some became catatonic, staring at nothing, unresponsive to commands or questions. The ship's surgeons had never seen anything like it from prisoners coming from other prisons. It was as if the extreme isolation at Pentonville had wound these men so tight that the sudden change, the sudden proximity to other human beings, caused them to snap. The voyage itself was its own ordeal. Depending on which port you departed from and where exactly in Australia you were headed, the journey could take anywhere from 3 to 6 months, 3 to 6 months at sea, in chains, in a crowded hold with minimal food and water. Have you ever been on a boat for even a few hours and felt seasick? Now imagine that feeling for months. Many prisoners spent the entire voyage ill, unable to keep food down, growing weaker by the day. The ships used for transportation were called convict ships, and they varied wildly in quality. Some were relatively well-maintained naval vessels repurposed for prisoner transport. Others were merchant ships that took convict transport contracts to make extra money between cargo runs. The conditions on these ships ranged from barely tolerable to nightmarish. Prisoners were kept below deck in holds that had been converted into makeshift prisons. Wooden platforms served as bunks, stacked 2 or 3 high, with barely enough room to sit up. You were chained to your bunk or to other prisoners to prevent escape, not that escape was possible in the middle of the ocean. Let me tell you about a specific ship, the Tortoise. Remember George Brasher's father from our discussion of children in prisons? His father was transported on the Tortoise in 1842. Historical records of the Tortoise describe conditions that were typical for convict ships of the era. 220 male prisoners crammed into holds designed for cargo, not people. Limited ventilation, just a few grates and hatches that were often closed during storms. No sanitation beyond buckets that were emptied once a day, if you were lucky. The smell below deck was described by one witness as so overwhelming that it made you gag even before you descended the ladder. Food on convict ships was rationed strictly. You'd get salt beef or salt pork preserved in brine, and so salty it made your lips crack. Hard biscuits called as ship's biscuit or hardtack that were often infested with weevils. You'd tap the biscuit on the table to make the weevils fall out before you ate it. Water was rationed, maybe a quart per day, and it was stored in barrels where it would grow stagnant and develop a strange taste. Fresh fruits and vegetables were impossible to keep on long voyages, so scurvy was common. Your gums would bleed, your teeth would loosen, old wounds would reopen, and there was nothing to be done about it until you reached land. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions: typhoid, dysentery, typhus. If one person got sick, everyone got sick. The death rate on convict ships varied widely depending on the ship, the captain, the surgeon, and sheer luck. On well-run ships with decent conditions and a competent surgeon, maybe 5 to 10% of prisoners would die during the voyage. On poorly run ships, the death rate could climb to 20 or 30%. 1 in 5 prisoners dead before ever reaching Australia. Their bodies were wrapped in canvas, weighted with stones, and dropped overboard with a brief prayer. No grave, no marker, just the ocean swallowing them up as if they'd never existed. Women prisoners faced additional horrors during transportation. Female convicts were usually kept in a separate section of the hold, but the barriers were often minimal. Guards had access. Male crew members had access. And women prisoners were vulnerable in ways that male prisoners weren't. Sexual assault was common and rarely punished. If a woman became pregnant during the voyage, well, that was treated as her fault. as evidence of her immoral nature, not as a crime committed against her. Some women gave birth on these ships, in the hold, in chains, with only other prisoners to help them. Many of these babies didn't survive the voyage. Neither did all the mothers. The journey was also mentally devastating. Imagine being from a small English village, never having travelled more than a few miles from where you were born, and suddenly you're on a ship crossing oceans you didn't know existed, headed to a continent you've never heard of. The sheer vastness of the journey was incomprehensible to many prisoners. Some thought they were being taken to their deaths. Some believed they'd never reach land at all, they'd just sail forever until they starved. The psychological impact of being torn from everything familiar and thrust into this alien environment was profound. And yet, there was a strange camaraderie that developed on some convict ships. Men and women who'd been kept in isolation, forbidden from speaking, suddenly found themselves surrounded by hundreds of fellow prisoners. Yes, you were chained. Yes, you were sick and miserable, but you could talk. You could share stories. You could form connections with other human beings. For prisoners coming from the separate system, this was the first real human interaction they'd had in over a year. Some of them clung to these connections desperately, forming friendships that would last through their sentences in Australia and beyond. The ship's surgeons kept detailed journals documenting the voyage. These journals are fascinating historical sources because they provide a window into what life was like on these ships. Surgeons would note who died and from what cause. They'd record outbreaks of disease and how they tried to treat them. They'd document behavioural problems, fights among prisoners, suicide attempts. Reading these journals now, you can feel the surgeons' frustration. They were often decent men trying to keep hundreds of people alive under impossible conditions with limited medical supplies and no real authority over how the ship was run. Some surgeons genuinely cared about their charges. They'd advocate for better conditions, more food, cleaner water. They'd set up schools on board, teaching prisoners to read or giving them useful information about what to expect in Australia. They'd organise exercise periods where prisoners were brought on deck in small groups to get fresh air and sunlight. But other surgeons were indifferent or actively cruel. They saw the prisoners as cargo, not people, and treated them accordingly. The experience you had during transportation depended hugely on which kind of surgeon you got. Eventually, after months at sea, land would appear on the horizon. Australia. The end of the journey and the beginning of a new ordeal. Ships would dock at various ports. Hobart in Van Diemen's Land, now called Tasmania. Sydney in New South Wales. Other settlements along the Australian coast. Prisoners would be unloaded, still in chains, weak from the voyage, blinking in the bright sunlight they hadn't seen in months. And then the sorting would begin. Your behaviour during the 18 months at Pentonville, documented in reports that travelled with you, determined what happened next. The best-behaved prisoners received tickets of leave. These were essentially parole documents. You were assigned to a master, someone who'd employ you, usually a farmer or business owner who needed labour. You'd work for wages, though a portion went back to the colonial government. You had some freedom to move around, to choose where you lived within certain boundaries. If you stayed out of trouble and completed your sentence, you could become a fully free settler, able to stay in Australia with all the rights of any other British subject. But if your behaviour at Pentonville had been poor, or if you'd caused trouble during the voyage, you were assigned to hard labour. This meant chain gangs. Picture this. You're still in chains, now connected to 20 or 30 other prisoners. You march to work sites, often miles away from where you sleep. You build roads, you clear land, you break rocks. You do back-breaking labour under the Australian sun, which is fiercer than anything you experienced in England. Guards watch you constantly. If you slow down, you're whipped. If you try to escape, you're caught, brought back and punished severely. Sometimes publicly flogged, sometimes put in isolation cells even more severe than anything at Pentonville. Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania, was known as the harshest destination. The penal settlements there, Port Arthur, being the most infamous, were designed to be places of ultimate punishment. Port Arthur was where the worst-behaved convicts were sent. Repeat offenders, violent prisoners, men who'd tried to escape from other settlements. Port Arthur was isolation, hard labour and brutal discipline all combined. It was meant to break you completely, and for many prisoners it did. But here's something that's almost never discussed. Transportation, for all its horrors, also offered something that staying in England didn't. Hope, a chance, however slim, at a new life. If you completed your sentence and earned your freedom, you could stay in Australia. You could claim land. You could start a farm or a business. You could marry and have children who would be born free without the stain of criminality that marked you. Some transported convicts did exactly this and built successful lives in Australia. Not many, but some. And there's an interesting historical quirk here. Many Australians today are descended from transported convicts. What was once a mark of shame has become so in some families a point of pride. My great-great-great-grandfather came over on a convict ship, is now said with a certain swagger. An acknowledgement that your ancestors were tough enough to survive something most people can't imagine. Australia itself has embraced this history, turning old penal colonies into tourist attractions, preserving convict ships and prisons as museums. The suffering has been transformed, at least partially, into heritage. But we shouldn't romanticize this. For every convict who succeeded in Australia, there were dozens who died there, broken by labour or disease or despair. For every family reunion between a transported prisoner and relatives who managed to follow them to Australia years later, there were hundreds of families permanently separated, never knowing what happened to their loved ones after that ship sailed over the horizon. Transportation was exile. It was loss. It was the deliberate destruction of the life you knew, with only the faintest possibility of building something new from the ruins. By the 1830s, Australia was starting to complain. The colonial authorities there were getting tired of being Britain's dumping ground for criminals. They wanted to attract free settlers, respectable people who'd come to Australia by choice to build their futures. Having thousands of convicts pouring in every year wasn't exactly attractive to potential immigrants. Come to Australia, it's beautiful. Also, it's full of criminals, isn't the best marketing pitch. So Australia started pushing back, lobbying the British government to end transportation. It took time. Transportation to New South Wales ended in 1840, to Tasmania in 1853, to Western Australia, the last destination still accepting convicts, in 1868. After that, transportation as a punishment officially ended. Britain would have to find other ways to deal with its criminals, which meant building more prisons, which brings us full circle to where we started, to those massive Victorian prison building programs, those 90 prisons constructed in just 35 years. But before transportation ended completely, before that final convict ship made its last voyage, there were still prisoners living through this system. Still people being torn from their homes and sent to the far side of the world. And among them were some names you might recognize, some people who would become famous or infamous for reasons having nothing to do with their crimes. Because Victorian prisons didn't just hold anonymous poor people, they also held writers, activists, criminals so notorious that their names became household words. And their stories, their experiences behind those iron bars, give us yet another perspective on what the Victorian prison system really was. Not just a machine for punishment, but a stage where some of the most dramatic stories of the era played out. And that's where we're heading next. Fame is a strange thing. It can elevate you to heights most people never reach. It can also make your fall that much more spectacular, that much more public, that much more devastating. And in Victorian England, if you were famous and you fell hard. You fell into the same prisons we've been discussing, the same cells, the same silence, the same crushing routine. Except everyone knew you were there. Everyone was watching. Your humiliation wasn't private. It was entertainment for the masses, a morality tale about what happens when you step outside society's boundaries. Let me introduce you to some people whose names you might recognize. People who walked through those iron gates and discovered that fame means nothing when the door slams shut behind you. Jack Sheppard. Now there's a name that electrified London in the 1720s. Wait, you're thinking 1720s? That's before the Victorian era, you're absolutely right. But Jack's story is so central to how Victorians thought about crime and criminals that we need to start with him. Jack was a thief, a burglar, and he was absolutely brilliant at escaping from prison. Not once, not twice, 4 times. 4 separate escapes from various London prisons, each one more daring than the last. His most famous escape was from Newgate Prison in 1724. Jack was chained to the floor in a cell called the Castle, considered the most secure room in the prison. He was wearing heavy irons on his wrists and ankles, and he escaped. How? He picked his locks using a bent nail. Then he broke through 6 locked doors, climbing up a chimney, crossing rooftops, and lowering himself down with a rope made from bedsheets. Sounds like something from a movie, doesn't it? But it actually happened. Witnesses documented it. The authorities were baffled. Jack became a folk hero. The common people loved him. Here was a poor boy from the slums who'd made fools of the wealthy and powerful. Who'd proven that walls and chains couldn't hold someone with enough cleverness and courage? Ballads were written about him. Plays were performed. His face appeared on prints sold in markets. When Jack was finally captured for the last time and executed at age 22, over 200,000 people showed up to watch. 200,000. That's roughly a third of London's entire population at the time. His execution was the biggest public event of the decade. Why am I telling you about Jack? Because his legend haunted Victorian prisons. Every time a prisoner escaped, the newspapers would compare them to Jack Sheppard. Every time authorities designed a new, supposedly escape-proof cell, they'd say it was too secure even for Jack Sheppard. He became the standard by which all other criminal cleverness was measured. And the Victorians, obsessed with crime and punishment, kept his story alive through plays and novels. They were simultaneously horrified by criminals and fascinated by them. And nowhere was that fascination more evident than in their treatment of famous prisoners. Let's jump forward to the Victorian era proper. Charles Dickens's father, John Dickens, was imprisoned in Marshalsea Debtors' Prison in 1824. Not for theft or violence, but for debt. He owed £40, a sum he couldn't pay. So he was locked up in Marshalsea, a prison that had existed since medieval times and was notorious for its terrible conditions. Debtors' prisons were their own strange category. You weren't there for committing a crime in the traditional sense. You were there because you owed money, and you'd stay there until you paid your debt or struck a deal with your creditors. Here's the insane logic of debtors' prisons. You owe money, so we're going to lock you up where you can't earn any money, which means you definitely won't be able to pay your debt. Makes perfect sense, right? The idea was that your family or friends would pay on your behalf to get you released. If you had no family or friends with money, well, you were simply stuck. Some people spent years in debtors' prisons. Some died there. When John Dickens was imprisoned, his entire family moved into the prison with him, except for 12-year-old Charles. This was common practice. Families could live in debtors' prisons if they had nowhere else to go, which tells you something about the desperation of poverty. Young Charles was sent to work in a factory to help support the family, labelling bottles for 6 shillings a week. The experience traumatised him. He wrote about it later in his life, describing the humiliation, the fear, the sense of abandonment. And Marshalsea Prison appears in several of his novels, most notably Little Dorrit, where he drew directly from his childhood memories. The shame of having a family member in prison was intense in Victorian society. Even though John Dickens's debt was eventually paid and he was released, Charles Dickens carried that shame his entire life. He rarely spoke about his father's imprisonment. When he became famous as a writer, he tried to hide this part of his past. But it shaped everything he wrote. His sympathy for the poor, his anger at unjust systems, his detailed descriptions of prisons and workhouses, all of it came from those childhood experiences of visiting his father behind bars. Now let's talk about someone whose imprisonment was for something quite different. Oscar Wilde, playwright, poet, celebrity, and one of the most famous men in London in the 1890s. Wilde was convicted in 1895 of gross indecency, which was the legal term used for homosexual acts. His trial was a sensation. The newspapers covered every detail. His wit and cleverness, which had made him famous, were on full display even in the courtroom. But wit doesn't save you from prison. He was sentenced to 2 years of hard labour. Wilde spent time in several prisons, including a brief stay at Pentonville before being transferred to Wandsworth and then Reading Jail. And for someone of Wilde's sensitivity, someone who lived for beauty and art and intellectual stimulation, the Victorian prison system was particularly devastating. He was subjected to the same rules as everyone else. Silence, isolation, pointless labour turning the crank in his cell thousands of times per day to earn his meals. An aesthete and artist reduced to a number, forced to wear a prison uniform marked with broad arrows, forbidden from having books except for the Bible and religious tracts. Wilde wrote about his experience later in a long letter that was published as De Profundis, and in The Ballad of Reading Jail, a poem about watching another prisoner be executed. His descriptions of prison life are heartbreaking. He wrote about the silence, how it drove men mad, about the cruelty of the guards, about the terrible food that left prisoners constantly hungry, about the humiliation of having every aspect of your dignity stripped away. The vilest deeds like poison weeds bloom well in prison air, he wrote. It is only what is good in man that wastes and withers there. Oscar Wilde entered prison as a celebrity and emerged broken. His health was ruined. His spirit was crushed. He lived only 3 years after his release, dying in exile in Paris at age 46. His imprisonment destroyed him, and Victorian society watched it happen with a mixture of pity and satisfaction. He'd been too clever, too different, too willing to challenge conventional morality. His punishment was seen as fitting by many, a warning to others about what happens when you deviate from acceptable behaviour. Then there were the political prisoners, members of the Fenian movement, Irish Republicans fighting for independence from Britain, who were arrested and imprisoned for their activities. In 1867, an event occurred that shocked Victorian London. Fenians attempted to break one of their members, Richard O'Sullivan Burke, out of Clerkenwell House of Detention. They packed gunpowder against the prison wall and lit it, expecting the explosion to create a hole through which Burke could escape. The explosion was much larger than they'd planned. The wall did come down, but it also destroyed houses across the street. 12 people were killed, over 100 were injured. The event became known as the Clerkenwell outrage, and it terrified Londoners. Prisons were supposed to be impenetrable. The idea that someone would attack a prison from the outside was almost unthinkable. Security was immediately increased at all London prisons, and the Fenian responsible for organising the explosion, Michael Barrett, became the last person to be publicly executed in England, hanged outside Newgate Prison in 1868 before a crowd of thousands. But perhaps the most haunting category of famous prisoners were the ones who became famous because of their crimes. Charles Peace was one of these, a burglar and murderer who terrorised England in the 1870s. Peace was clever, he disguised himself brilliantly and could impersonate different accents and characters. He committed dozens of burglaries before he was finally caught in 1878. After his arrest and conviction, he became a celebrity of sorts. People were fascinated by his cleverness, his ability to evade capture for so long. When he was hanged at Leeds Prison in 1879, the event drew massive crowds. Victorian society had this weird relationship with criminals. They were horrified by crime, absolutely obsessed with punishment and moral reform, but they were also deeply fascinated by criminals, especially clever or notorious ones. Newspapers sold well when they had crime stories. People would attend trials as entertainment, packing courtrooms to watch proceedings. Executions were public spectacles that drew thousands of spectators. There was something almost celebratory about it all, which seems deeply strange to us now, but was perfectly normal in Victorian culture. And this brings us to someone who wasn't a prisoner himself, but who changed how Victorian society thought about prisoners. Charles Dickens, the same boy who'd visited his father in Marshalsea, became as an adult one of the most prominent voices commenting on crime and punishment. He visited prisons regularly, both in England and during his travels to America. He wrote scathingly about prison conditions. He argued that the separate system was cruel and psychologically destructive. Remember, this was a man who'd seen firsthand what poverty and imprisonment could do to a family. But Dickens was complicated on this issue. He believed in punishment. He believed that criminals needed to be held accountable. He just thought the methods being used were counterproductive and inhumane. He advocated for reform, for better conditions, for treating prisoners like human beings capable of change. And because Dickens was immensely popular, his opinions mattered. His novels, which often featured prisons and prisoners, shaped public opinion. When people read Oliver Twist or Little Dorrit or Great Expectations, they weren't just enjoying stories, they were being educated about the realities of crime and punishment in Victorian society. Another interesting case is that of the women I mentioned earlier, the suffragettes. These women were political prisoners, arrested for acts of protest rather than traditional crimes, and they became celebrities because of their imprisonment. Their hunger strikes and the government's brutal response with forced feeding became national scandals. Newspapers couldn't get enough of the story. Public opinion started to shift, not necessarily in favour of women's suffrage right away, but certainly in favour of treating these women better while they were imprisoned. The most famous suffragette prisoner was probably Emmeline Pankhurst, who was arrested multiple times between 1900 and 1914. Each arrest made headlines, each imprisonment was documented in detail, and each release, often early because she'd become so weak from hunger striking that the authorities feared she'd die and become a martyr, was celebrated by her supporters. The suffragettes understood something that many prisoners didn't have the luxury of understanding. Fame is power. Public attention is protection. If everyone knows you're in prison, the authorities have to be more careful about how they treat you. This raises an uncomfortable question. If famous prisoners received better treatment, or at least more public scrutiny of their treatment, what does that say about how nameless prisoners were treated? We know about Oscar Wilde's suffering because he wrote about it beautifully. We know about the suffragettes because they had networks of supporters documenting everything. But what about the thousands of prisoners whose stories weren't recorded? Whose suffering happened in silence and darkness, with no one watching, no one caring? The answer is probably that they were treated worse, much worse. Fame offered at least some protection. If you were nobody, if you had no family with influence, no friends with resources, no public watching your case, then you were completely at the mercy of a system that had very little mercy to give. You could be beaten and no one would know. You could die and barely anyone would notice you. Your suffering would be invisible, acceptable, unremarkable. Victorian prisons held everyone. The famous and the anonymous, the political activist and the desperate thief, the writer and the illiterate, the adult and the child, rich debtors who'd fallen on hard times and poor people who had never had good times to begin with. And the system treated them all, theoretically the same silence, the same labour, the same routine. But in practice there were always differences, always hierarchies, always ways that money or fame or connections could make your experience slightly less terrible. These famous prisoners, their stories serve a purpose for us beyond just being interesting historical anecdotes. They remind us that the people in Victorian prisons were individuals. They had personalities, talents, dreams, fears. Jack Sheppard was clever and brave. Oscar Wilde was brilliant and sensitive. The suffragettes were passionate and determined. Charles Dickens's father was just a man who'd gotten into debt and couldn't get out. They weren't just statistics in prison records. They were human beings caught up in a system that, for all its claims about reform and redemption, was fundamentally about control and punishment. As we near the end of our journey through Victorian prisons, we need to ask ourselves what happened to all of this. These massive stone buildings, these systems of silence and isolation, these philosophies of punishment and reform. Because some of those Victorian prisons are still standing, still operating, still holding prisoners today over 150 years after they were built. And that fact, that reality, raises profound questions about how much we've really changed, about whether the Victorian approach to imprisonment ever truly ended, or if it just evolved into something slightly different but fundamentally the same. That's what we're going to explore now, as we bring our story into the modern era and see how the long shadow of Victorian punishment still falls across the present day. Walk past a Victorian prison today, and you might not even realise what you're looking at. The massive stone walls, the tiny windows, the imposing gate that seems designed to swallow hope. You might think it's a museum, a historical monument, something preserved from a distant past that we've long since moved beyond. But look closer. See those security cameras, that modern lighting, those guards in contemporary uniforms. This isn't a museum, this is a working prison. Right now in 2025 there are people living behind those Victorian walls, sleeping in cells designed in 1842, walking corridors planned when Queen Victoria was a young woman. And that should shock us. It should make us ask questions. Because if we're still using buildings from an era we acknowledge was brutal and inhumane, what does that say about how much we've really changed? 32 Victorian-era prisons are still operational in England and Wales today. 32. That's not a handful, that's not a few historical buildings kept running for sentimental reasons. That's a significant portion of the prison system. These 32 prisons currently hold approximately 22,000 inmates. 22,000 human beings. That's roughly 1/4 of England's entire prison population, living in buildings that were designed over a century and a half ago, based on philosophies we now recognise as psychologically harmful. Let me take you inside one of these prisons as it exists today, Her Majesty's Prison Liverpool, or as it's sometimes called by inmates and staff, Hellmarsh, a play on the name of another notorious prison. Liverpool Prison opened in 1855. That makes it 170 years old as of this year. The building itself is largely unchanged from its Victorian origins. The same radial design we discussed earlier. The same narrow cells. The same thick walls designed to prevent sound from travelling between prisoners. But now those Victorian walls are covered with modern additions. security cameras mounted on brackets, electrical wiring running along the outside of buildings because the walls were never designed to have electricity running through them, air conditioning units bolted to windows that were meant to provide only minimal ventilation, modern plumbing retrofitted through spaces never intended for it. The prison looks like what it is, a Victorian building desperately trying to accommodate 21st century needs and failing in visible, sometimes dangerous ways. In 2017, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons issued a damning report about Liverpool Prison. The conditions were described as some of the worst they'd seen. Overcrowding was severe, with prisoners often doubled up in cells designed for single occupancy, cells that were already barely adequate when they were built. Sanitation was poor, violence was high, drug use was rampant. The report used the word squalid multiple times. This wasn't ancient history they were describing. This was 5 years ago in what's supposed to be a modern, humane justice system. The government's response? A £6 million refurbishment of one wing. £6 million to repaint walls, replace windows, install new electrical sockets, and update flooring in 90 cells. That sounds like a lot of money, and it is. But think about what they're doing. They're putting a fresh coat of paint on a fundamentally flawed building. They're replacing Victorian windows with modern ones, but the walls those windows sit in are still the same thick stone designed to create isolation. They're updating the electrical system, but they can't change the basic architecture that makes these buildings so unsuitable for contemporary use. Why are they still using these Victorian prisons? The answer is complicated, but ultimately comes down to two things: money and capacity. Building new prisons is extraordinarily expensive. A modern prison facility can cost hundreds of millions of pounds. And where do you build it? No community wants a prison in their neighbourhood. The planning process takes years, involves endless consultations and protests. Meanwhile, the Victorian prisons are already there, already built, already operating. Yes, they're falling apart and completely inadequate, but they exist, and that makes them convenient. Capacity is the other issue. England's prison population has grown significantly over the past few decades. More people are being imprisoned, and sentences have gotten longer. The system needs space for all these prisoners. Closing Victorian prisons without having new facilities ready to replace them would mean releasing prisoners or severely overcrowding other institutions even more than they already are. So the Victorian prisons stay open year after year, decade after decade, long past when they should have been retired. But it gets worse. The architecture itself is dangerous. In 2018, there were serious disturbances at Her Majesty's Prison Birmingham, another Victorian facility. Prisoners rioted, taking control of parts of the prison for hours. During the investigation afterward, it was noted that the Victorian building's design had been weaponized. Prisoners had broken off pieces of the old infrastructure, pipes, railings, parts of cells, and used them as weapons. The building was literally falling apart in ways that endangered both prisoners and staff. Similar incidents occurred at Her Majesty's Prison Bedford and Her Majesty's Prison Liverpool. The pattern is clear. These old buildings are not just outdated and uncomfortable, they're actively dangerous. They create environments where violence is more likely, where control is harder to maintain, where both prisoners and staff are at risk. And yet they remain in use. There's something darkly ironic about this. The Victorians built these prisons with such confidence, such certainty that they'd solve the problem of crime and punishment. They invested enormous resources, over £84,000 just for Pentonville, millions more for all the others. They created buildings designed to last centuries, and they have lasted. But not as monuments to Victorian wisdom, rather as monuments to Victorian hubris. These buildings have outlasted the philosophies that created them. The separate system abandoned, the silent system ended, The treadwheel's banned, but the buildings remain, repurposed and retrofitted, but fundamentally unchanged. And here's what's truly disturbing. Public perception hasn't entirely moved on from Victorian attitudes. There's a term that appears frequently in British media when discussing old prisons: Dickensian conditions. It's used to describe places that are dirty, overcrowded, cruel, but there's often an undertone in how it's used. A suggestion that maybe for certain prisoners, for certain crimes, Dickensian conditions are appropriate. That suffering is part of punishment. That we shouldn't be too concerned about how terrible these places are, because after all, the people in them are criminals. They did something wrong. Why should they be comfortable? This attitude, this belief that punishment should include suffering beyond the loss of freedom itself, is pure Victorian thinking. It's the same mindset that created the treadwheel and the crank. The same belief that criminals need to be broken before they can be reformed. We've dressed it up in modern language. We talk about being tough on crime instead of implementing hard labour, hard fare and hard board. But the underlying philosophy is remarkably similar. And it's not just the buildings that persist. Some Victorian practices have modern equivalents. Solitary confinement, which we now recognise as psychologically damaging, is still used extensively. We don't call it the separate system anymore. We call it segregation or administrative detention. But it's the same thing. Locking someone in a cell alone for 23 hours a day, depriving them of human contact, exposing them to the same psychological risks that drove Pentonville prisoners mad. We know it causes harm. Studies have documented the effects: increased rates of mental illness, self-harm, suicide, and yet we keep doing it. The treadwheel is gone, yes, but prisoners are still required to work, often for wages that are absurdly low, sometimes for private companies that profit from their labour. The work isn't as physically brutal as turning a crank thousands of times, but it serves a similar purpose. It keeps prisoners occupied, it generates income for the prison system, and it reinforces the message that prisoners exist to be used, to produce value for society while receiving minimal compensation and no real benefits. Let me tell you about a specific example that illustrates how little has changed in some ways. In 2020, during the COVID pandemic, prisons went into lockdown. Prisoners were confined to their cells for 23 hours a day to prevent the spread of disease. This meant no work, no education programs, no visits from family, no exercise beyond 1 hour alone in a yard. Essentially, every prisoner in the system was placed in conditions identical to the Victorian separate system, and the effects were immediate and predictable. Mental health crises, increased self-harm, suicide attempts, violence when prisoners were let out of their cells. The exact same problems the Victorians documented in the 1840s happened again in 2020. The government presented this as an unfortunate but necessary response to a health crisis. But it also revealed something important. The infrastructure was already there to essentially recreate Victorian prison conditions. The cells designed for isolation. The routines built around control rather than rehabilitation. The whole system could revert to its Victorian form almost instantly, because fundamentally it never fully moved away from it. Now contrast this with how some other countries approach imprisonment. Scandinavian countries, particularly Norway, have taken a completely different approach. Norwegian prisons focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment. Cells are more like small apartments than cages. Prisoners have access to education, job training, therapy, outdoor activities. The recidivism rate, the rate at which former prisoners commit new crimes, is dramatically lower than in countries like the United Kingdom or the United States. It's not because Norwegians are inherently better people. It's because the system treats prisoners as human beings who will eventually return to society and should be prepared for that return rather than as criminals who need to be punished and broken. Could Britain adopt this approach? Theoretically, yes. Practically, it would require tearing down or completely repurposing those 32 Victorian prisons and building entirely new facilities designed around different principles. It would require a massive shift in public attitudes about what prison should be, and it would cost billions of pounds. None of which seems likely to happen anytime soon. So the Victorian prisons persist. Year after year, they're patched and painted and retrofitted. Millions of pounds are spent maintaining buildings that should probably be museums instead of operational prisons, and the people inside them, the 22,000 prisoners living in Victorian conditions, they pay the price for this failure of imagination and political will. There's a particular cruelty in this that I think needs to be acknowledged. These prisoners know they're living in buildings from another era. They can see the Victorian architecture. They can feel the weight of all that history pressing down on them. And they must wonder why, in 2025, in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, they're being housed in conditions that we acknowledge were inhumane when they were created. The staff who work in these prisons struggle too. Corrections officers trying to maintain safety and order in buildings that fight against them. Buildings with blind spots where cameras can't see. Hidden spaces in ancient architecture where contraband can be hidden. Structures that are literally crumbling, with pieces falling off that can be used as weapons. It's not just prisoners who suffer from the continued use of Victorian prisons. It's everyone who works in them, everyone who visits family members there, everyone touched by a system that refuses to let go of its past. Some Victorian prisons have been closed. Her Majesty's Prison, Shrewsbury, shut down in 2013 after operating for over 200 years. It's now a tourist attraction, offering guided tours where visitors can see what Victorian imprisonment was really like. The irony is thick. We'll preserve these buildings as museums to educate people about how terrible the past was, but we'll also keep other identical buildings running as actual prisons, subjecting real people to those same conditions we're telling tourists were unacceptable and inhumane. The government has announced plans to close more Victorian prisons and replace them with modern facilities. But these announcements have been made repeatedly over the past several decades, and the old prisons keep operating, because closing them requires having somewhere else to put the prisoners, and building new prisons is politically difficult, expensive, and time-consuming. So the cycle continues. Reports document terrible conditions. Refurbishments are announced. Money is spent on the temporary improvements. A few years pass. Another report documents terrible conditions, and nothing fundamental changes. This is the legacy of Victorian prisons in the modern era. Not the reform and redemption the Victorians promised, not the transformation of criminals into productive citizens, just endurance, buildings that won't die, systems that won't change, philosophies that persist long after we've supposedly moved beyond them. The Victorian era ended over a century ago, but in these 32 prisons, in the cells where 22,000 people live today, the Victorian era never really ended at all. And this brings us to perhaps the most important question of our entire journey through Victorian prisons. What do we do about this? How do we break free from the legacy of Victorian punishment? How do we create a justice system that actually serves justice rather than just perpetuating cycles of harm? These are not easy questions. They require us to confront uncomfortable truths about what we believe punishment should be, about who deserves compassion and who doesn't, about whether we truly believe in rehabilitation or if we're still, deep down, Victorian in our hearts. And that's what we need to explore now, as we bring our journey to its conclusion and ask ourselves what lessons, if any, we've learned from this dark chapter of history. History has a way of teaching us lessons if we're willing to listen, but sometimes the lessons are uncomfortable. Sometimes they force us to acknowledge that the past isn't as distant as we'd like to believe, that the mistakes our ancestors made are mistakes we're still making, that the systems we inherited, even when we recognize them as flawed, are incredibly difficult to change. Victorian prisons were built on a foundation of beliefs that seem, from our modern perspective, obviously wrong. Isolation doesn't reform, it destroys. Meaningless labor doesn't rehabilitate, it breaks spirits. Punishment alone, without support or opportunity, just creates more desperation and more crime. We know these things now. We have the research, the data, the psychological understanding that the Victorians lacked. So why haven't we done better? Let me start with something that might surprise you. The Victorian prison system wasn't created by monsters, it was created by reformers, people who genuinely believed they were making things better. Before the Victorian era, prisons were chaotic, disease-ridden places where prisoners were essentially warehoused with minimal supervision. Corruption was rampant. Rich prisoners could buy comfort, while poor prisoners starved. There was no system, no philosophy, just containment. The Victorians looked at this and said, "We can do better." And in some ways they did. They brought order. They brought hygiene, at least relative to what came before. They brought the idea that prisons should have a purpose beyond just holding people. But their solution was built on flawed assumptions. They assumed that criminality was primarily a moral failing, rather than often a response to poverty and lack of opportunity. They assumed that isolation would lead to reflection and reform rather than madness. They assumed that suffering was necessary for transformation. And they assumed that they, the educated middle and upper classes, knew what was best for the poor criminals they were trying to save from themselves. These assumptions led them to create a system that caused immense harm while believing they were doing good. That's the first lesson. Good intentions are not enough. In fact, good intentions can be dangerous when they're not paired with humility and a willingness to question your own assumptions. The Victorian reformers were so confident in their rightness that they dismissed evidence that contradicted their beliefs. When prisoners went mad from isolation, the reformers called them liars or said they were predisposed to madness. When the separate system clearly wasn't working, they defended it for decades rather than admit they'd been wrong. Pride and certainty made them blind to the suffering they were causing. We see this pattern repeated throughout history. People implementing policies they're convinced are right, dismissing feedback that suggests otherwise, and causing harm while believing they're helping. The lesson for us is to hold our own certainties lightly, to listen to the people affected by our systems rather than just the people designing them, to be willing to admit when something isn't working and change course even when doing so means acknowledging we were wrong. The second lesson is about the danger of dehumanization. Victorian society made it easier to treat prisoners cruelly by first deciding that prisoners were fundamentally different from respectable people. They were called the criminal class, as if criminality was an inherited trait rather than often a response to circumstances. They were reduced to numbers. They were dressed in uniforms marked with arrows to make sure everyone knew what they were. They were forbidden from speaking, from having names, from maintaining the connections and identities that make us human. Once you've dehumanized someone, it becomes much easier to justify their suffering. This is not unique to the Victorians. Every system of oppression throughout history has relied on dehumanization. Slavery required convincing people that enslaved individuals were somehow less than human. Genocide requires the same process of othering, of creating categories that make it possible to see certain groups as not fully deserving of compassion or rights. The Victorian prison system was less extreme than these examples, obviously, but it used the same psychological mechanism. Make the prisoners other. Make them criminals, fallen people, moral failures. Then you can lock them in tiny cells and work them until they break and tell yourself you're reforming them rather than destroying them. The lesson here is to resist dehumanization in all its forms, To remember that the categories we create, criminal and law-abiding, deserving and undeserving, are often more about maintaining social hierarchies than about any fundamental difference between people. Every prisoner was once a baby, once a child with dreams, once a person who made choices in a context that we, if we were honest, might not have navigated any better. That doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it should prevent us from treating people as if they're disposable or beyond redemption. The third lesson is about the persistence of systems. Once you've built something massive, a network of 90 prisons, a workforce of thousands of guards and administrators, a set of laws and procedures and bureaucratic process, that thing takes on a life of its own, becomes incredibly difficult to change, even when everyone agrees it's not working. There's inertia. There are vested interests. There are people whose jobs and identities are tied to the existing system. There's the simple fact that tearing something down and rebuilding it from scratch requires resources and political will that are often in short supply. The Victorian prison system should have been reformed much sooner than it was. The evidence that the separate system was causing mental breakdowns was clear by the late 1840s, but the system wasn't significantly changed until the late 1800s, and even then many practices continued well into the 20th century. Hard labour wasn't officially abolished until 1948. That's over a century of continuing practices that were known to be harmful. Why? Because changing systems is hard. Easier to make small adjustments, to paint the walls and pretend that's enough, than to fundamentally reimagine how things should work. This is true in every area of society. Education systems that don't serve students well, healthcare systems that leave people behind, economic systems that perpetuate inequality. We often know these systems are flawed. We have plenty of evidence. But actually, changing them requires overcoming enormous obstacles. The lesson is that we need to be persistent, that we need to keep pushing for change even when progress is slow, and that we need to be willing to be radical when incremental reform clearly isn't enough. Sometimes you can't just renovate the Victorian prison, you have to tear it down and build something entirely new. The fourth lesson is about who we listen to. Throughout the Victorian era, the people with the least power, the prisoners themselves, were the ones whose voices were least heard. When they reported the psychological torture of isolation, their reports were dismissed. When they tried to explain the desperation that had driven them to crime, no one was interested. The people making decisions about prison policy were people who had never experienced prison themselves. Upper and middle-class men who'd never known poverty, who'd never been desperate enough to steal food, who'd never been locked in a cell and told they weren't allowed to speak. This disconnect between policymakers and affected populations is still a problem today. Laws about poverty are made by people who've never been poor. Policies about immigration are made by people who were born with citizenship. Rules about criminal justice are made by people who've never been arrested. And again, these policies fail to account for the realities of the people they affect, because the people making them simply don't understand those realities. They can imagine. They can theorize, but imagination is not experience. The lesson is that we need to center the voices of people who are directly affected by policies. Former prisoners should be consulted about prison reform. Poor people should be involved in discussions about poverty. This doesn't mean we simply do whatever any individual wants. Democracy is more complicated than that. But it does mean we can't keep making decisions about people without including them in the conversation. The Victorian reformers thought they knew what prisoners needed. They were wrong. We need to learn from that mistake. The fifth lesson, and this might be the most important one, is about the purpose of punishment. What are we trying to achieve when we lock someone up? The Victorians said they wanted reform and redemption, but their actions revealed that they also wanted suffering. They wanted criminals to pay for their crimes not just with time, but with pain. The treadwheel that went nowhere, the crank that produced nothing, the silence that drove people mad. These weren't about rehabilitation, they were about making sure punishment hurt. We still struggle with this question. Is prison meant to be rehabilitative, helping people change so they can successfully rejoin society? Is it meant to be punitive, making people suffer as payback for the harm they caused? Is it meant to be protective, simply removing dangerous people from society? Is it meant to be deterrent, making the threat of prison so terrible that people don't commit crimes in the first place? These purposes are often in conflict with each other. What makes for good deterrence, making prison as horrible as possible, directly contradicts what makes for good rehabilitation, creating an environment where people can heal and grow. The Victorians tried to do all of these things at once and ended up creating a system that didn't do any of them well. Prisons didn't deter crime, rates kept rising. They didn't rehabilitate, recidivism was high. They did protect society by keeping criminals locked up, but only temporarily, and the punishment, the suffering inflicted, was so severe that it often made people worse, rather than better. Broken people emerging from broken systems, more damaged than when they entered. The lesson is that we need to decide what we actually want from our justice system and design it accordingly. If we want rehabilitation, we need to invest in education, therapy, job training, all the things that actually help people change. If we want deterrence, we need to accept that harsh punishment doesn't actually deter crime as much as we think it does. Certainty of being caught is a much bigger deterrent than severity of punishment, which means we should invest in effective policing and justice rather than just making prisons more terrible. If we want protection, we need to be honest about which crimes actually require long-term incarceration and which don't. But here's the hard part. Deciding these things requires us to confront our own desires for revenge. When someone commits a terrible crime, especially a crime that affects us personally, we want them to suffer. That's a human emotion. It's understandable. But building a justice system on that emotion leads us back to the Victorian model. Suffering for suffering's sake. Punishment that doesn't serve any larger purpose except satisfying our anger. And that's not justice. That's just cruelty dressed up in legal language. The sixth lesson is about the role of poverty. Victorian prisons were full of people whose primary crime was being poor. Stealing food because you were hungry, stealing clothing because you had nothing to wear, being drunk and disorderly because alcohol was the only escape from a miserable existence. Yes, there were also violent criminals and people who committed serious crimes, but the majority of prisoners were there because society had failed to provide them with any legitimate way to survive, and instead of addressing the poverty, Victorian society addressed the symptoms by locking poor people up and trying to punish the poverty out of them. This is still true. Modern prisons, including those Victorian buildings still in use, are disproportionately filled with poor people. People who committed crimes driven by desperation, or who couldn't afford good legal representation, or who were in the wrong place at the wrong time and had no resources to fight the charges. Wealth buys you options. It buys you lawyers. It buys you the benefit of the doubt. Poverty takes those options away. The lesson is that we can't solve crime without addressing poverty, that locking people up is treating a symptom, not the disease. That if we want fewer people in prison, we need to create societies where people have opportunities that don't require breaking the law. The seventh and final lesson is about hope. Despite everything we've discussed, despite all the cruelty and failure and suffering, people survived. They found small ways to maintain their humanity. They whispered encouragement to each other. They took care of fellow prisoners who were weak or sick. They held on to dreams of freedom and better days. Some of them emerged from prison and built good lives. Some found redemption not because of the system, but despite it. The human spirit, it turns out, is incredibly resilient, more resilient than the Victorians gave it credit for. This resilience is not an excuse for bad systems. We shouldn't make people suffer and then praise them for surviving. That's cruel. But it is a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, humanity persists. The prisoners who resisted, who helped each other, who refused to be completely broken, they were enacting a form of rebellion. They were saying through their actions, "You can control my body, but you can't control my soul. You can lock me up, but you can't make me stop being human." And that lesson, that reminder of human resilience and dignity, is perhaps what we need most as we think about how to move forward. Because the problems we've inherited from the Victorian era are enormous, but they're not insurmountable. People changed the Victorian prison system, slowly and incompletely, but they did change it. They ended the treadwheel. They stopped the separate system. They improved conditions, at least somewhat. It took generations. It required countless individuals pushing for reform. But it happened because people refused to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. We face similar challenges today. Those 32 Victorian prisons still operating, the continued use of solitary confinement, the exploitation of prison labour, the dehumanization of people who've made mistakes, the failure to address the poverty and lack of opportunity that drives much crime. These are massive systemic problems, but they're not inevitable. They exist because of choices we've made as a society. And what we've chosen, we can choose differently. What we've built, we can rebuild. What we've inherited, we can transform. The question is whether we will, whether we have the political will, the moral courage, and the sustained commitment required to actually change these systems, rather than just talking about changing them. The Victorians built their prisons to last centuries, and they have. But permanence in architecture doesn't require permanence in purpose. We can repurpose these buildings. We can transform these systems. We can honour the people who suffered in Victorian prisons by making sure that future generations don't suffer in the same ways. That's the challenge. That's the responsibility. And that's the hope. As we prepare to close this journey through the dark world of Victorian prisons, we need to bring everything together. All the stories we've heard, all the suffering we've witnessed, all the lessons we've learned, because history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding where we came from so we can decide where we're going. And the story of Victorian prisons, for all its darkness, for all its examples of human cruelty and systemic failure, is ultimately a story about us, about what we're capable of, both terrible and hopeful, about what we inherit and what we choose to change, about the long shadow of history and our power to step out of it. That's what we need to explore now in our final moments together, as we ask ourselves what this journey through Victorian prisons means for us today, and what we're going to do with everything we've learned. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the iron gates and stone corridors of Victorian prisons. We've walked through those massive doors that seemed designed to swallow hope. We've stood in cells barely larger than a closet, felt the weight of our lawnmowers pressing down, imagined the endless turning of the tread wheel, heard the cries of children too young to understand why they're being punished. We've sailed on convict ships to the far side of the world. We've met famous prisoners and forgotten ones, women separated from their children, men driven mad by isolation. We've seen how the shadows of those Victorian walls still fall across the present day, how buildings built over 150 years ago still hold human beings today. It's been a dark journey. I won't pretend otherwise. There's been suffering in every chapter, cruelty in every system we've explored. But there's also been something else: resilience. Humanity persisting in the darkest places, small acts of kindness between prisoners, reforms, however slow and incomplete, pushed through by people who refused to accept that cruelty was inevitable. And perhaps most importantly, there's been the act of remembering itself. Because these stories, these people, they were meant to be forgotten. The Victorian prison system was designed to erase individuality, to reduce people to numbers, to make their suffering invisible. By remembering them tonight, by speaking their names and telling their stories, we're undoing that erasure at least a little bit. Let me take you back one more time to where we started. To that moment when someone, maybe someone like you, maybe someone completely different, stands at the entrance of a Victorian prison. But this time, let's imagine it differently. Imagine that instead of a place of punishment and isolation, those massive buildings were transformed into something else. Centres for education, housing for people who need it, community spaces, museums that honestly confront the past rather than celebrating it. The architecture would remain, the historical significance preserved, but the purpose would be completely different. The buildings that once broke people would now support them. Is this naive? Maybe. Probably. The practical obstacles are enormous. But here's the thing about hope. It doesn't require certainty. It doesn't require a detailed plan for exactly how to get from here to there. It just requires the belief that change is possible and the willingness to work toward it. The Victorians believed with absolute certainty that their prison system was right and necessary. They were wrong. Our certainties might be just as flawed. The systems we accept as inevitable might be just as changeable as the systems they created, and we've slowly dismantled. Think about all the things that have changed since the Victorian era. Women can vote, something the suffragettes were imprisoned for demanding. Child labour is illegal, though Victorian society depended on it. We have worker protections, social safety nets, public education, concepts of human rights that would have seemed radical or incomprehensible to most Victorians. These changes didn't happen automatically. They happened because people pushed for them, generation after generation, often in the face of fierce resistance from those who benefited from the old systems or simply couldn't imagine alternatives. The same is true for how we treat people who've broken laws. The treadwheel is gone. The separate system is gone, officially at least. We no longer transport people to the other side of the world or execute them for minor property crimes. These are real improvements. They prove that change is possible, but they also show how incomplete that change has been. We ended the treadwheel but kept solitary confinement. We stopped transporting prisoners to Australia, but still separate them from their families in prisons far from home. We recognized that the separate system drove people mad but still use isolation as punishment. We've changed the details while keeping much of the underlying philosophy. Real change, transformative change, requires more than just stopping the worst practices. It requires reimagining the whole system from the ground up. Asking not, how can we punish people more humanely? But, what does justice actually require? What serves victims, communities, and those who've caused harm? What creates safety in the long term rather than just satisfying our immediate desire for revenge? These are hard questions. They don't have easy answers. Different people will answer them differently based on their values and experiences, but we need to be asking them, and we need to be asking them while centering the voices of people who've been through the system. Every improvement in prison conditions, from the ending of the treadwheel to the recognition that solitary confinement is torture, has come partly because former prisoners and their advocates shared their experiences. When Oscar Wilde wrote about his imprisonment, when the suffragettes documented their force-feeding, when countless unnamed prisoners told their stories to reformers who would listen, They created the evidence that made change possible. We need to keep listening, keep amplifying those voices, keep believing people when they tell us about their suffering, rather than dismissing them as criminals who deserve what they get. I want to acknowledge something. If you've been listening to this entire story, if you've stayed with me through all these hours of darkness and suffering, you might be feeling heavy, sad, maybe even a little hopeless. That's understandable. This hasn't been a cheerful tale, but I hope you're also feeling something else, connection, to the people whose stories we've shared, to the long arc of history and your place in it, to the ongoing project of building a more just and humane society, because that's what history is for. Not to make us feel good about how far we've come, though sometimes that's appropriate, and not to make us despair at how little has changed, though sometimes that feels accurate, but to help us understand where we are, how we got here, and what's possible going forward. The Victorian prison system was built by people who thought they were solving problems. They looked at the chaos and corruption of earlier prisons and said, "We can do better." And in some ways they did, and in other ways they created new horrors. We're in a similar position now. We've inherited their buildings, and to some extent their philosophies. We can see the problems. We have knowledge they didn't have about psychology, about trauma, about what actually helps people change. We have examples from other countries showing different approaches. We have the testimony of people who've experienced prison and can tell us what does and doesn't work. We have everything we need to build better systems. Everything except, perhaps, the collective will to actually do it. And that's where you come in. Yes, you, listening to this in the dark or the quiet or wherever you are right now, you're part of the society that maintains these systems or changes them. Your beliefs matter. Your votes matter if you vote. Your conversations with friends and family matter. Your willingness to see prisoners as human beings rather than as a category of others who deserve whatever they get, that matters enormously. Systems change when enough people decide they should change and put pressure on those in power to make it happen. I'm not saying you need to become a prison reform activist, though. If that's your calling, the world needs you. I'm just saying that the attitudes we hold, the compassion we're willing to extend or withhold, the complexity we're willing to sit with rather than retreating into simple stories about good guys and bad guys, these things shape the world in ways both subtle and profound. The Victorian prison system persisted partly because most people weren't thinking about it. It was out of sight. Behind those massive walls, happening to people they didn't know and didn't have to care about. It only changed when enough people started paying attention and demanding something different. So maybe the most important thing you can take from this journey is simply awareness. Knowledge of what these systems were and are. Consciousness of the suffering they've caused and continue to cause. Unwillingness to look away or accept easy answers. Because once you know, you can't fully unknow. The stories we've shared tonight, they become part of your understanding of the world, and that changes how you move through it, even in small ways. Let me leave you with one final image. Picture that Victorian prison we've visited so many times throughout this journey. The hub-and-spoke design, the narrow cells, the thick walls, but now picture it empty, not abandoned, just empty for a moment. Quiet in a way that's peaceful rather than oppressive. And in that emptiness, in that space between what was and what could be, there's possibility. The possibility that we can learn from this history rather than repeat it. That we can honour the people who suffered by building systems that don't create the same suffering. That we can be the generation that finally breaks free from Victorian certainties and Victorian cruelties and creates something better. Will we? I don't know. History doesn't move in straight lines. Progress isn't inevitable. We might fail, We might pass these same problems on to the next generation just as they were passed to us, but we might not. We might be part of the change. We might look back in 20 years or 50 years and see that this was the period when things finally started to shift in meaningful ways, when those 32 Victorian prisons were finally closed or transformed, when we stopped using isolation as punishment, when we started treating people who'd broken laws as human beings who deserve both accountability and the possibility of redemption. That future exists, not guaranteed, but possible, waiting for us to reach toward it. And every person who understands the past, who refuses to accept cruelty as inevitable, who maintains their compassion even for people society says don't deserve it, every person like that makes that future a little more likely, makes the long arc of history bend a little more toward justice, to borrow a phrase, makes the suffering we've witnessed tonight mean something beyond just suffering. The Victorian era is over. Queen Victoria died in 1901, over 120 years ago. Everyone who walked through the gates of Pentonville Prison in 1842 is long dead. The chaplains who designed the separate system, the prisoners who endured it, the reformers who fought against it, all gone. But the buildings remain, the ideas remain. The question of how we treat people who've done wrong, that remains. It's our question now, our responsibility, our opportunity. So as we close the door on this journey through Victorian prisons, as we step back out through those iron gates into the night, I want to thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with these difficult stories. Thank you for caring enough about people you'll never meet, people from a time long past, to spend hours learning about their suffering. That caring matters. That attention matters. It's the opposite of the Victorian prison system's goal of making suffering invisible. You've chosen to see. And once you see, you're changed. And when you change, the world changes, even if just a little bit. These buildings of stone and iron and desperate history, they're still standing. But they won't stand forever. Nothing does. Systems that seem permanent eventually fall. Buildings that seem eternal eventually crumble. The question is what we build in their place, what world we create with the knowledge we've gained and the compassion we've cultivated. The Victorians built prisons that would last centuries. Let's build something better, something that, when people look back on it 150 years from now, makes them think they learned, they changed, they did better than the generation before them. Let's be the generation that deserves that assessment. The night is dark, the past is heavy, but dawn always comes, change always remains possible, and hope, that stubborn, resilient thing that persists in the darkest places, hope endures. Just like those prisoners who whispered encouragement to each other through thick walls, just like the reformers who kept pushing even when progress seemed impossible. Just like every person throughout history who's refused to accept that cruelty is inevitable, or that the way things are is the way things must be. We carry that same hope forward, that same possibility, that same responsibility. And with that, our journey through Victorian prisons is complete. But the story continues. Your story, your choices, your impact on the systems that still shape so many lives. Thank you for traveling with me through this dark but important history. Thank you for listening, for caring, for thinking. I hope you'll carry these stories with you, not as burdens, but as knowledge, as motivation, as reminders of what humans are capable of, both terrible and transcendent. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Hold on to your compassion. Question your certainties. Remember those who've been forgotten, and believe in the possibility of change even when it seems distant, even when it seems impossible. Because nothing is truly impossible until we collectively decide to stop trying. And I don't think we're ready to stop yet. Good night, sleep well, and I'll see you in the next story.